Disclaimer. This video contains spoilers for The Stories of Sodor, Stories of War, and the SCPs of Sodor by Victor Tanzig. Parts of this video may be distressing for some viewers. Viewers' discretion is therefore advised. Now, you've all probably seen this original video of this, which, by the way, thank you everyone. I did not expect that high of a turnout when I made that original video. But anyways, let me clarify. This is indeed the same video, just more a remastered version of it, because I will admit that the original timeline video is not the greatest at all. But I have learned more stuff with editing, so let's give it another chance, shall we? And also to add Season 6, because relevancy. So, the script for this video will likely sound very familiar in some places, but I won't sound so cold sounding voice that I had back then, because let's hopefully it sounds better. Hopefully, please. We know generally when the series ends, most likely in 2015, as we see Edward tell the stories of Sodor to the engines on the Brendan branch line and other places. But Victor Tanzig has not finished the series just yet, with at the time of recording currently in late 1968. There are 6 seasons ranging from roughly 1934 to 1968, with a 7th season obviously in the works. We have 2 specials and technically 2 spin-off series to cover, so in total with everything that we have roughly 97 episodes worth of content. There are of course lore dumps mentioned throughout the series, as well as the years that the events take place, so I've arranged them all into linear order to better understand events for later seasons. So things that may appear in, let's say, 1942 may not appear relevant, but will appear a lot relevant in like the mid-60s. Also, quick side note, the SCPs of Sodor may not be canon to some people, but it is open-ended enough that I feel like it can work and fit within the main series, so I will be including the events that take place, but I'll mark them with asterisks and to show that it may not be canon to some people in its own separate segment. With all that out of the way, sit back with a drink or food. This is going to be a long one. I now present the Stories of Sodor timeline, spanning from the early years to 1968, with a few sprinklings from 2015 thrown in for good measure. Also, some of these years are kind of headcanon explanations, as specific dates aren't mentioned with some of the events that happen in flashbacks. Our story starts in 1856 with the formation of the Sodor and Mainland Railway. In a workshop in Glasgow during the same year, the first recorded non-faceless engine was built. His name was Clive. Neil and Matthew were built soon after, being shipped to Sodor in the same year. The S&M from Vickerstown to Crovan's Gate was completed in December 1857. We experience quite a big time jump here, for in 1879 we see the construction of the Harwich tramway on the north of Sodor, hoping to connect the various towns around Harwich to the harbour itself. Toby was built and purchased during this time to help run the line. In 1882, construction of the Mid-Sodor Railway from King Ory's Bridge started, and Duke was built and purchased for the line, being delivered literally in parts by horse and cart. Also in 1882, the S&M reached Marin, following the construction of the viaduct. However, the finances of the S&M became low at this point, with the S&M struggling on for the next 30ish years. In 1884, the slate mine on the MSR opened, leading the MSR to purchase another engine. This engine would be a small industrial engine called Atlas, who also helped out with the goods work on the line. Also in 1884, the Crovan's Gate Railway Company was formed, primarily to ship ballast from the hills to the ever-expanding S&M. Skarloey and Rheneas were purchased in the same year. In 1885, the Crovan's Gate Railway reached the town of Boxford, establishing the main ballast plant in the same year. Also in 1885, the Wellsworth and Sudbury Railway was formed, with the construction of Wellsworth Station in 1886. Adam, Lily and Colin were purchased for the line, extending the line down the Brendan Peninsula, stopping at Sudbury and at Brendan itself, building the docks. The S&M would also build the line over Gordon's Hill, known then as the Preston Incline, named after Nathaniel Preston, the owner of the WNS. In 1887, there was a huge storm on the island, causing flash flooding in the ballast quarry on the GCR, trapping workmen on top of buildings and huts. Skarloey was sent to rescue them, charging through the floodwaters to rescue the workmen, at great risk to his own safety as the cold water made contact with his very hot firebox. The name change to the Skarloey Railway following his heroism was undertaken in 1888, giving it the name that we are all familiar with today. In 1891, Edward was built to haul passenger trains on the Furness Railway on the mainland. In 1896, Edward on the Furness Railway would be momentarily transferred to a western part of the line, While he was there, he met Samson, mocking him for being an industrial engine only. But, while he was on his transfer detail, Edward took a long line of steel rails down the line, forgetting about the steep hill, quickly becoming a runaway. Samson was nearby and with his strong power was able to save Edward. Approximately in 1901, Wyeth was sent to South Africa to help with the Second Boer War, meeting and talking with Winston Churchill and Mahatma Gandhi. One day, the train of diamonds he was carrying was robbed by bandits, the diamonds never being found again, except they were found again, but that is for much later. In 1902, the WNS expanded to Crosby, building the station on the main line. In 1903, the Crovensgate workshops opened, quickly getting a reputation for an excellent standard of work, able to fix and repair any engine. Kyle Harrigan was one of the main businessmen financing the Harwich tramway, whose wife Henrietta was fond of the railway. Henrietta was Spanish, teaching Toby a decent number of the Spanish language during his time on the Harwich tramway. In 1903, tragically Henrietta would die from influenza. This led Kyle to neglect the railway, eventually leading to its closure in 1904. But in 1904 the Elsbridge and Knapford Railway was formed, being able to take up the opportunity to purchase Toby on the cheap. He was shipped from Harwich to Brendam, encountering animosity from the WNS crew. Following the closure of the Harwich tramway, the MSR bought the land, using the land to expand the MSR. Stewart and Falcon were purchased and arrived to the line in 1904. In 1905, Toby helped expand the line from Crosby to Elsbridge. The E&K needed another engine, so commissioned the Crovensgate workshop to build another engine, an engine you may all be familiar with. His name was Thomas. From the lowlands, Stewart and Falcon built the line, and from the hills, Duke and Atlas expanded the line, both ends meeting at Islesdale in 1906. In 1907, the Furness Railway began to decline. The Furness Railway itself had been operating since 1844. Edward, Winston and Albert were the only non-Faces engines on the line, with the exception of Samson, but he's a privately owned engine on an industrial line, so he doesn't really count under the umbrella. Anyways, an opportunity to expand the Furness Railway was proposed, but unfortunately, while the investors were on the Furness Railway, a few accidents happened. The most serious accident involved the collapse of a rail crane onto a stack of dynamite, destroying a decent part of Dalton Yard. The investors were scared off by the incident that had happened, causing the Furness Railway to file for bankruptcy in October 1907. Albert went to work for the LBSCR, and Winston went to work at the Great Eastern Railway. In 1907, the E&K extended to Knapford, therefore purchasing Edward for passenger earning service the same year. In 1910, Railgate Prison was built, designed to hold non-faceless vehicles for a maximum of 30 days, or 15 years for a certain engine, as any more than 30 days would have a massive impact on a railway if the engine was in prison, unable to perform the duty of hauling revenue-earning trains. Also in 1910, Ivo Hugh joined the SKR, helping to expand the line for 3 years to the various towns and villages along the river, causing the SKR to become a fully fledged railway in 1913. Wilbert Audrey was born in 1911, eventually becoming a clergyman. You may have heard of him. And yes, I said born this time. I am aware of my gaffe on the original video. Yes, okay, move on. In 1914, the S&M filed for bankruptcy, and Neil, Clive and Matthew were momentarily leased to a joint railway effort, and considering the year they were currently in, I'm pretty sure you can guess what was currently happening. World War II started in 1914, which was obviously a very bad thing, but it did have some momentary good for Sodor. The main line was to be extended through Tidmouth all the way to Islesborough on the northwestern side of Sodor for defensive purposes, but that would take a few years to be completed. In 1915, the WNS would finish the construction of the China clay pits near Brendam. Also in 1915, a new rail line would be constructed from Lower Knapford to Knapford, with a tunnel through the hills called Ballyhoo Tunnel, later renamed Henry's Tunnel. The previous line from Elsbridge to Knapford would become the Loop Line, an alternate route of trains derailed on the main line. Farmer McCall's farm is located on this loop line. In 1915 as well, due to signalman error, Edward was on the same line as Adam, carrying a fully loaded passenger train. Brian the brake van decided bravely to stay on the line, intending to slow and stop Edward. Edward stops just in front of the barber shop, but the barber was not impressed. He almost lathered Brian and Edward's faces with shaving cream when Jackson Bailey intervened, calming the barber and explaining the situation. This is our first mention of Jackson Bailey, and trust me, you'll hear his name a lot more as we progress through this video. In 1916, the Knapford Harbour was constructed, with the purchase of 10 cents and Drolan to help with general manoeuvres. During the construction, one of the quays was built on unstable platforms, leading to its sinking into the harbour. Following the completion of the Knapford Harbour, Drolan was sent to be a general tugboat for the Brendam Harbour, while 10 cents stayed at Knapford. On the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway during this time, James and his partner Amanda were working with munitions until one day James accidentally bumped a railgun that had a live round in it. The round would hit explosives, killing Amanda and heavily damaging James. James would always have PTSD whenever he saw railguns and any heavy equipment related to it. In the USA in 1917, Stanley was built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works, being shipped overseas to the front line in France. Also in 1917, the lumber mill at Carlton was built, as well as the coal mine at Marston Heights and the start of the Farquhar branch line. The Farquhar branch line itself was mainly built by WIF during this year, a governmentally owned engine. At Mont Saint-Cyr in France, the British fort came under attack, and a lieutenant, a 24-year-old Topham Hatt, who was a guard on Stanley's train that day, ran to a nearby gun emplacement, defending against the Germans for over an hour. Topham would be sent home on medical leave, as he had PTSD from this event. The ship that he was on, the Lady Rose, would be torpedoed in a storm while it's on its way to Sodor from France. The sole survivor, Topham Hatt again, would signal a passing freighter with a lamp that had been aboard. Topham Hatt would hold on to this lamp until he was sent to the hospital at Carlton. While on his way there, the lamp fell out of the coach after the train crossed over a dodgy crossing. Wesley Anderson was the main man who ran the Carlton Hospital, notoriously running experiments on some of the soldiers to test ways to overcome mental illnesses, practices that were shortly banned after the war. Topham Hatt would be at the hospital till the end of the war, being experimented on himself to get over the loss of the lamp that had saved his life and the PTSD he had received at Mont Saint-Cyr. A bunch of dynamite was stolen the day before from a workman's hut along the extension to Islesborough. Some German spies had snuck onto Sodor, intending to blow up Knapford Harbour. This plot was foiled when a nearby truck saw the exchange happen, alerting the authorities. The lorry that was transporting the dynamite took off in a hurry, having to swerve around a lamp that had been placed onto the main line, crashing into a wall as a result. None of the engines knew where the lamp had come from, dubbing it the Lucky Lamp, as it allowed the capture of the German spies. The Lucky Lamp would pass around the various railways on Sodor, always seeming to appear at the right time. The Farquhar branch line would open for revenue-earning service in 1918. The standard gauge railway would reach Islesborough as well in 1918, creating a through traffic route for the MSR to the NWR. And finally, World War I would end in November of 1918. Towards the end of 1918, after the war had ended, Neil was sent to work at the China clay pits, and Matthew went to work at the lumber mill. Clive helped to extend the Farquhar branch line up to Anofa to form a new stone quarry, which he then ended up working at. In 1919, WIF was sent back to Barrow, helping to build the shunting yards and scrapping facilities. WIF was then assigned as the Barrow Station pilot. In 1919, Henry was built from stolen designs from Sir Nigel Gresley, having too small of a firebox. Andreas was purchased in 1920 to work on the MSR as its designated express engine. In 1921, the Railway Act was passed, grouping all the out-of-control railways of Britain into 4 individual groups. They were as follows: the London and North Eastern Railway, the London, Midland and Scottish Railway, the Great Western Railway, and the Southern Railway. The Vickerstown Lift Bridge would be built towards the end of 1921, the same year that Mr. Starr and Mr. Zorro joined the railways. The E&K and the WNS were grouped into the LNER and LMS respectively in approximately 1922. The LNER crew were nicknamed the Nor'easters, while the LMS crew were nicknamed the Middies, but I'll just call them by their actual names just for simplicity. In 1923, Gordon arrived on Sodor for the LNER, as well as Arthur and Douglas for the LMS. But tragically, in the winter of 1923, Arthur would die in an accident where he was trying to make up for lost time on a delayed passenger train. In doing so, he crashed at the base of Gordon's Hill. His spirit is said to haunt the railway whenever someone tells his tale, always trying to reach his final destination on time. Following the death of Arthur, Donald was brought to Sodor for the LMS. Mickey was also brought to Sodor, becoming the designated fire and rescue engine for the next roughly 40 years. In 1924, Reginald arrived on Sodor for the LMS as well as James and Henry for the LNER. In 1925, Patrick Clifton, a former workman for the Sodor and Mainland Railway, now turned postman, was walking next to a train in a lumber yard when Matthew had back onto the train. Some of the logs had been improperly loaded, and so some of the logs would crush and kill Patrick. Matthew would suppress these memories for the next 40 odd years. In 1926, Knapford Station was upgraded from 2 platforms to 5, with a through line on the 6th rail line. In 1928, Douglas was purchased for the SKR from the Barnhill Railway, following the closure of the latter one due to very dodgy practices. In 1929, the stock market on Wall Street tumbled, causing the Great Depression worldwide. While the UK didn't suffer as dreadfully as the USA, everything became quite a little bit tight, notably on the railways. Soon, the Big Four were effectively fighting for contracts for certain trains and construction projects, hoping to get by in the trying times. Also in 1929, the fuel depot at Lower Knapford was built. In 1929, Henry was given the chance to try and pull the express. Needless to say, there's a reason why he mainly does goods work. In 1930, the Tidmouth Dairy at Tidmouth was built. In 1931, Bruce was built by Walter Paxman, an experimental locomotive powered by a diesel engine, different to the traditional steam engine. Doug and Bruce would work on a branch line shared by the LMS and GWR, as Bruce learned the ropes of shunting. Bruce would rule the yard with an iron fist whenever Duck was out of earshot. Following a few incidents, one of these involving a truck being smashed down a hill, and Bruce's engine failing, his iron grip began to slip. It then got to a point where the truck sang a song teasing Diesel about being a diesel, simply just calling him Diesel. The name soon stuck, and that's what I'm basically going to call him for the rest of this video. Diesel would be purchased for LMS operations on Sodor, becoming the only diesel engine on Sodor for many years. In 1933, an outbreak of mad cow disease caused Joey to come to Sodor, being tasked with ensuring no infected cattle would be transported to market. And now we have finally come to the main part of the series itself, covering the events from 1934 to 1965, which is very vast in terms of content. So I'll try and condense down the episodes, but it will take a while. I'll just mark events of significance, or at least those that I deem to be significant. Some of the years are unknown specifically, but so I will be guessing in some cases just based upon historical and general hints in the episodes themselves. In 1934, Percy would arrive for the LNER, becoming the shunter at Knapford Station. Within his first week, Percy had a few troubles around the Duchess contract. Due to the context of the Great Depression, the LNER and LMS basically fought each other for the contracts and revenue from companies upon successful completion. Thomas, James, and Percy were the only engines available to pull the Duchess contract for the LNER, but with meddling from Diesel throwing Colleen the truck into the back of Percy, the contract was given to the LMS. But Percy thought he was to blame, but Doug, who had been from the GWR visiting, had seen this whole thing play out, thereby acquitting Percy of any wrongdoing, and so Percy was allowed to stay with the LNER. Diesel would get 15 days in Railgate for throwing Colleen into Percy. Which, by the way, if someone in the comments can tell me how many days Diesel spends in Railgate or just in prison in general, let me know. I think it might actually be 100. The British Union of Fascists would be formed in 1934, dedicated to spreading the fascist ideals of the then newly elected Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. I don't think anyone will know about him. I think he'll just be a politician that passes out of the way. Roughly 6 months after Percy arrived on Sodor, Mr. Starr decided that Percy was capable enough to be shown how the Far Cry branch line operated, with Thomas taking him up the line to show Percy all the sides. A huge stone order from a Nova quarry had to go out that day, so Thomas and Percy alternated taking stone trains to Ellsbridge to be transferred to Henry's train. On the final train, Thomas would be stopped and almost arrested by a policeman under the rules that an engine must have side plates, you know, all that kind of rubbish BS, but as it turns out, this rubbish BS was based upon regulations that had been out of date for a few years. But this whole fiasco would not stop all the engines of the LNER and LMS getting the rulebook read to them, albeit from a guy that, as is described, had the charisma of a wet blanket. A few weeks later, Edward and Duke would be having a discussion about Amelia Earhart, the famous woman aviator, while Edward got his train loaded with slate and other goods. Stewart's train was delayed, but Edward had to leave without him to keep to the timetable of the ship at Knapford Harbour. Adam, who had been shunting at Islesborough, decided to take the opportunity when Stewart finally arrived and took his load, effectively earning the contract for the LMS and not the LNER. Percy had been sent to collect the train from Knapford, stopping Adam under Article 219 of the Fair Transport Act. A policeman was nearby and raised the alarm, stopping Adam and causing a whole debate about whether Adam stole the train or was doing the LNER a favour. Percy, as a consequence of this, was given the train itself, delivering it to Knapford Harbour so the ship could set sail. We are still in 1934 with the construction of the Ellsbridge Harbour under the Sodor construction scheme, aimed at getting jobs for people during the Great Depression. At the yard in Carlton, the turntable jammed, causing James to be delayed with a train for the Ellsbridge Harbour. When he was finally allowed to get to his train, he stood off as fast as he could, tearing down the line as fast as he could as well. One of the axle boxes on one of the trucks began to overheat and spark, causing a fire to be started next to Henry's tunnel, causing a fire that damaged the power grid and the field next to the line, causing the LNER to cover the cost of the repairs. Wellsworth Yard was also upgraded under the Sodor construction scheme. When Diesel and Colin delivered a train to the yard, a stray spark from Colin caused some trucks of coal to catch alight. The fire soon spread to other trucks in the yard. A workman had been left behind, so Thomas, who was on the scene, bravely decided to go in and rescue him. Unfortunately for him, his safety valve burst at this moment, grinding him to a standstill. Fortunately for Thomas, Colin was able to save Thomas, allowing both of them to escape the yard so Mickey could extinguish the fire. I'm going to place an incident involving Alfred and Geoffrey here in 1935 to give some variety. Alfred was scheduled to take a very important train for the Duke and Duchess of Boxford, but due to a convenient placement of a faulty truck, Alfred was stuck in a shed. Spencer was nearby, however, and was put onto the train, being purchased by the Duke and Duchess as their own private engine. Needless to say, this incident caused some animosity between Alfred and Geoffrey. In the autumn of 1936, the LNER's Express would suffer a few incidents with Gordon and James. Gordon would break down on the Preston Incline, and James's train would suffer a leaky brake pipe, having to be fixed with bootlaces and newspaper. The Preston Incline was therefore renamed to Gordon's Hill, for he had the honour of being the first engine to break down on it. There's a minor discrepancy with the timeline, as Victor states that Eric and Peter were purchased in 1935 for the LNER and LMS, but their introductory story takes place in 1936. So let's just say it's 1936 here. Well, I'm going to put in 1935 here, but say 1936 just so everything makes sense. Following the incidents with the LNER Express, passenger numbers were at an all-time low, but goods traffic continued to climb. Henry was a valuable asset for the LNER fleet, as he could pull trains that the LMS had to double or triple head. He was the strongest engine on the island, until Peter arrived in 1936 for the LMS. Peter was stronger than Henry, turning the goods contracts one by one to the LMS from the LNER. One day, Edward accidentally took on bad water, struggling to pull his trains. He just about gave up at Wellsworth when Peter arrived in the yard. Shockingly, Peter offered to help Edward up the hill behind his train, doing so with incredible ease. A reporter for the local paper was on Edward's train, publishing an article about the incident. The wording of the article had caused more contracts to turn back to the LNER, resulting in Eric to be purchased for the LNER. Eric's design allowed him to pull trains just as long as Henry's, turning the tide back again to the LNER. We are still in 1936 with Eric being a valuable member for the LNER. However, he did have a habit of forgetting trains or taking the wrong trains entirely. The Elsbridge Harbour was completed around this time, intending to be expanded further. Eric was therefore put in charge of this project. One day, Eric would deliver a long train to Elsbridge. He decided to help Edward with shunting in the yard as he was early. Unfortunately, he left his stone train on the main line. Eric realised his mistake too late, just barely pulling the train off the main line as Henry passed through, heavily braking. Because of this heavy braking, his wheels became grounded, resulting in Henry being unable to move. Edward was put onto the Elsbridge Harbour project as a result, and Eric was put on permanent warning. One small mess up and he would have been sent away for good. At Brendam, a small shipment of China clay was being fulfilled. However, one day, Diesel accidentally pushed the whole train into the ocean, washing away all the valuable China clay. With the wedding of Mrs. Kindley's daughter in September 1936 fast approaching, the Reverend Wilbur Audrey arrived on Sodor for the first time to officiate the wedding. We have now reached 1937, with an influx of Spanish refugees from the Spanish Civil War, an uprising intending to overthrow the government. A ship full of refugees arrived at Brendam Harbour, causing quite a bit of disarray as no one could exactly understand the Spanish. Because Toby is able to speak Spanish, he was sent to Brendam Harbour and was able to translate and help the immigrants. The immigrants began to sail across Sodor, becoming integrated in the general Sudric society. One day on Thomas's train, however, one of the pregnant immigrants went into labour. Needless to say, Thomas took off fast, intending to reach Elsbridge where an ambulance would take the passenger off to the hospital. Thomas had been rushing so fast that he burst his safety valve. Luckily for all parties involved, Eric was nearby and was able to pull the broken down Thomas to Elsbridge. Station Master Jeffries, however, had sent away the ambulance before they arrived, causing the baby to be born at Elsbridge Station, being named Thomas Eric Galindus, in honour of the two engines who had helped with the situation. Thomas Galindus would eventually rise through the ranks of the railway, becoming Edward's driver. After Eric's performance with helping Thomas, Mr. Starr took Eric off permanent warning and put him in charge of the Knapford Harbour Extension project. At the Tory Wreck mines, Thomas accidentally fell into the mine shaft as the danger board had been moved by some practical joker. One day, Lily was taking a train of scrap to the Barrow scrapyards, but one of the trucks hadn't been tied down properly. The pipe struck the corner of the bridge at Crovan's Gate, and because of the broken down bus above, the bridge began to sag. Unfortunately, regional was expected to come through under the bridge at any given moment, so with quick thinking from Scarlowy, Gordon and Lily put their trucks under the bridge enough to support it as regional passed through. Needless to say, a new bridge was put in place. The contract going to the LNER for the LMS had effectively brought down the bridge. The winter of 1937 was very strong, with lots of ice and snow being on Sodor. Donald and Douglas, who were from Scotland, excelled at clearing the snowdrifts, as apparently the drifts in Scotland could be at least 30 feet deep, 10 metres deep for the Brits. Late one night, Edward tells the story of Arthur to the engines, Thomas believing that Arthur's ghost does indeed exist due to the various reported sightings across the years. Kate would be purchased for the coal mines and Marston Heights, as the previous arrangement had been a free-for-all amongst the other engines, being very inefficient indeed. Over the coming days, the engines began to report sightings of Arthur's ghost. Strangely an E2 engine as opposed to the 2MT that Arthur was, but let's not worry about that right now. Tragically one night, however, Arthur's ghost arrived at Marin Station. One unfortunate lady happened to look inside one of the coaches, going insane from the sight she saw. Mr. Zorro was brought in to deal with the ghost, as the theory was that Arthur had always listened to Mr. Zorro, and so with his help, Arthur's ghost disappeared for good. We now reach the year of 1938, a major year for Sodor indeed. All of the snow had melted, which had caused business to increase rapidly, causing the engines to be rushed off their wheels. Alfred was momentarily loaned as the express engine so Gordon could help with the goods work. Gordon and Henry encountered a cow on the bridge just outside of Crosby. That wouldn't be the only incident involving cows, however, for Edward would be pulling a goods train one day, when some cows broke through a fence and onto the line, damaging the couplings between some of the trucks. On Gordon's Hill, these trucks would then break away, sailing down the hill and crashing into Adam. A few weeks later, Thumper the Bull escaped his field, wandering down the loop line. Diesel went to stop the bull, only to be scared away himself. Unfortunately for Diesel, Toby saw the whole incident, reporting on his misfortunes to the rest of the LNER fleet naturally. An outbreak of foot and mouth disease in the cattle on Sodor caused quite a number of cattle trains to be quarantined, being guarded by a customs officer waving a red flag. Joey would be brought to Sodor once again to randomly spot check the trains. During this time, Burke and Blair were on Sodor, monitoring the engines and suggesting edits and improvements that Mr. Starr should make. The pair proposed to sell Toby as he was getting very old. Toby's boiler was indeed quite old at this point, acting up quite a lot. Percy went to go and collect a cattle train from Farmer Cole's farm, stopping when he saw a red flag waving man. Rather oddly, however, Percy would see Farmer McCall walk up to the man, hand him something, and then the red flag waving man walked away. Percy was suspicious of this, telling some of the engines at the yard. Diesel heard about this and took the opportunity and went for it, and in the ensuing commotion, Toby's boiler kicked it, spewing black smoke everywhere. Against Burke and Blair's orders, Mr. Starr ordered a full rebuild of Toby's boiler. Joey found out about McCall's bribery, arresting him. Diesel was momentarily detained during this time as he was found to be effectively grabbing a train that should not have been grabbed in the first place. On the MSR, Andreas would be taking a passenger train to the top station when Burke put out a cigarette in one of the coaches, causing quite a lot of pain to the coach in question. Andreas wished him because of what he did to that coach. Burke had been having an affair during his time on Sodor, which was found out due to some trucks leaking the story. Needless to say, Burke lost his job and his wife following the incident, but this would not be the last time we would see of Burke or Blair. Douglas was having some troubles with a rather spiteful brakeman named Dominic, who would always give trouble for either Donald or Douglas. Donald would be given 7 days incarceration for bumping Dominic one day at Brendam Docks. One day, when Douglas was helping James up Gordon's Hill, he pushed too hard and Dominic was therefore destroyed, killing him, but like Burke and Blair, this would not be the last time we would see Dominic. Scott, formerly Flying Scotsman, would come to Sodor to help with odd jobs for the LNER, but because we can't have an engine imbalance, the LNER got their turn as well. Jeffrey would therefore come to Sodor to help with the work for the LMS, creating yet another rivalry. Seriously, there's like 5 different rivalries going on, why can't they just all live in peace, please? Jeffrey would of course bring trouble to Sodor with a spate of Axhall hotboxes befalling the LNER trains, causing delays for the LNER. Joey would connect the incidents and realise that the LMS was behind the incidents, but not who specifically was doing it, so he launched a sting operation, using Colleen the truck and Diesel to effectively arrest Jeffrey. Colleen would fall for a simple ruse, which then led to her giving up Diesel for what he did back in 1934 to Percy, which then led on to the events surrounding Jeffrey. Jeffrey would be shunted away for the maximum 30 days, being reassigned to other parts of the LMS for a good long while, but this would not be the last time we would see of the Red Engine. Stanley would be purchased in 1938 to help with the expanding goods services on the MSR, but quite a few incidents happened when he was on there. First, Stewart derailed on the points at Lower Aylesbury, and then the cranes called to pull Stewart back onto the line both failed. Stanley was then tasked with pulling Stewart back onto the line, which he did so with incredible ease, due to Stanley's design being American. USA, USA, USA. Later that day, Falcon and Stanley took the train up to the top of the line, with Falcon coming off the line up on the mountain road. But with Stanley's help, Falcon was able to be re-railed. A few days later, Stewart was up at the slate quarry when the slate trucks ran away on the incline, crashing into Stewart and damaging his funnel. Falcon had a theory at this time that all of the incidents were tied in with Stewart blowing his whistle, so one day they decided to test this theory. After getting Stewart to blow his whistle in the presence of Stanley, a box arrived, but it was a pipe and not Stewart's funnel. It appeared then that Stanley was indeed jinxed, but there was something that could help the MSR crew. That, of course, was the lucky lamp, being transferred from the Skarloey Railway to the MSR. Toby then told the story of how the lamp was first found with the sabotage attempt at Knapford Harbour in 1917. And with that, Season 1 is completed, spanning 1934 to mid-1938. But oh boy, does it get even more richer in content as we go along. I'd give this first season maybe a good solid 7 out of 5 out of 10, a great start for a series like this back in 2017. This is what the individual ranking looks like so far. Continuing on to Season 2, we are still in 1938 with the arrival of Montgomery to Sodor. Gordon was not pleased, for he was annoyed with the fact that Montgomery had supposedly gone 100 miles per hour in 1904, which was unverified at the time. Gordon's brother Scott had of course achieved 100 miles per hour in 1931, so that was where the argument was coming from. A remark about Montgomery not having a dome was mentioned by Gordon in passing. Coincidentally, the next day a loose brick from the bridge struck Gordon on his dome, so when he got to the viaduct, a teasing wind scooped onto Gordon's dome and took it clean right off and into the river below, disappearing under the mud and rocks. While Gordon was in the works, Ellis was brought to Sodor to be the temporary express engine. Inspection by a member of the railway board was undertaken on Sodor. This inspection thought to be an inspection about which railway would get the boot from Sodor, the LNER or the LMS. The inspector is a man that you should all know by now. This man was Sir Topham Hatt. During the inspection, Sir Topham Hatt ended up at the MSR, encountering Stanley, who he had served with in France during World War I. While Sir Topham Hatt was at Islesborough, however, Adam would then lose control of a fully laden tar wagon which careened out of the yard and into James, derailing and covering him in tar. A few days later, when Percy was trying to play a trick on the new branch line coaches, who were incredibly snooty, he ran into a luggage trolley, spilling jam everywhere and ending up with Sir Topham's trousers atop his funnel. Sir Topham Hatt was not impressed at all. He was going to have to make his decision about who was going to get the boot from Sodor, when a very serious incident changed all of this. An engine called Wendell came to Sodor, stealing trainloads of goods to take to a group of lorries, who had William hostage over unpaid debts with Wendell. Which, how does that really work? How does an engine kind of give money in that? Oh, let's not worry about that. With the help of Whiff, Lily and Thomas, Wendell was able to stop the 3 lorries, allowing Joey and the police to arrest the lorries. But due to the fact that Wendell had indeed been stealing in the first place, no matter the fact that Wendell was being blackmailed, Wendell was sent to a railgate for 15 days. This whole affair showed to Sir Topham Hatt what the engines of Sodor could do together, so he allowed both railways to stay on Sodor indefinitely. The boulder atop the hill just outside of Crosby was a major tourist site, with people flocking to the site to marvel at this strange circular boulder, very much unlike most other boulders in shape. One week in 1938, the rain came down hard, so much rain came down in fact, that the boulder began to move. It rolled onto the main line, almost squashed Diesel and Colton who were passing by the area. Needless to say, the boulder blocking the main line would cause many delays. Following an attempt to clear the boulder using Henry and Gordon, Billy Shoepack from the Franks & Sons munition factory was brought up for assistance. Billy was a specialist in dynamite, so decided to blow up the boulder, which gave very obvious results. The main line would be destroyed, but luckily it was rebuilt, after a few days or weeks of course. At Knapford Harbour during September 1938, the dog workers went on strike, causing a great deal of chaos for the LNER crew. Due to Knapford Harbour being closed, all ships were redirected to Brendam Harbour, causing so many trains in such a small area that some of the LNER crew had to then leave from effectively Knapford Harbour and go work with the LMS at Brendam Harbour. This arrangement was satisfactory for about a week or so, until tensions began to rise. One night while Duck was on Sodor, he decided to help Henry up Gordon's Hill, not knowing that the brake van was very old. When the train began to climb, all of Duck's weight transferred to the brake van, destroying it. Little did anyone know that the brake van's destruction would awake a certain entity. The tensions at Brendam all boiled to a point that Henry, Gordon and James all went on strike, protesting the conditions that they were working in, with abuse from the LMS crew constant. Mr. Starr was able to convince Henry, Gordon, and James to go back to Brendan, apologising for comments that he had said the previous night about potentially scrapping all of them. A few incidents involving goods trains would take place in November 1938, the first of which involved Lily's train breaking in half and the brake van disappearing suddenly, accompanied by a weird howling noise. The brake van and the guard, Richard Payton, were found in the vicarage orchard, the brake van destroyed and Richard a charred skeleton. Clearly something supernatural must to have been able to perform an act like this. A few days after the funeral for Richard, another accident would occur. James's train split in half just on Wellsworth Junction, with an unlucky Peter coming down Gordon's Hill at the time, who, being unable to stop in time, ploughed straight into James's train, causing enough damage to send Peter to the works for a good long while. As it turned out, it was Dominic who had been causing all the chaos, having been summoned due to Duck's accident on the hill. Dominic was out for revenge, plain and simple. One night, a group of engines set out to find Dominic and put an end to the madness. Douglas stood up to Dominic, impressing Lily to the point of falling in love with him, but they'll come into play a lot later down the line. Dominic was scared away, his spirit disappearing for good, or so the engines thought. In December 1938, due to Peter having to be in the works for the next 6 months or so, due to the injuries that he had sustained in his accident, Jeffrey was brought back to Sodor to help with the LMS goods work. Jeffrey had been in Railgate and had become the reformed engine. He went to all the engines that he had wronged, apologising to them all. Jeffrey's return on Sodor, however, was met with apprehension at first, for shortly after he had arrived, a span of sabotages occurred. First, Thomas was sent onto the wrong line, and since the rails had been covered with oil from a nearby barrel, Thomas went straight into the water. The barrel had come from King Ori's Bridge, so a delegation of police officers went up the line to investigate. However, a sabotage on the MSR was achieved by tampering with the points just before Andreas came through with his passenger train. Luckily for the MSR, there were no serious injuries, but that couldn't be said for the next accident on Sodor. Late one day in mid-December 1938, two young boys, twin brothers Robert and Sean Creedy, would watch a train pulled by Douglas pass by on their way back from school. Their father, Michael Creedy, was the guard on board the train, a rostering that would end up impacting Sodor in unforeseen ways. Early the next morning, the Flying Kipper was cruising down the line, heading from Knapford to Manchester. Just outside of Kildane, however, the snow had forced the signal down, causing Henry to crash at near full speed into the back half of Donald's goods train, killing the guard of Michael Creedy. His two sons, Robert and Sean, would be taken in by their uncle Gregory Hall, as their mother had killed herself due to the death of her husband, Mrs. Zorro being unable to help with the family and the house being foreclosed soon after. Gregory Hall would abuse both the boys, causing one of them to resent the railways that had killed his father, leading to a few major incidents, but that will be discussed a far lot later. The media outcry of the sabotage apparently being a murder, the mistress who was holding the saboteur gave him up, a Jacob Burke, as in Burke and Blair, the railway board investigators who were on Sodor back in 1938. Wow, okay, it's been about 6 whole pages of script since I started talking about 1938. It's really been a dense and packed year for Sodor, hasn't it? We are now officially in 1939, still another dense year for Sodor, but less dense than 1938. Due to Henry's accident involving the Flying Kipper, he was sent away to be repaired, and Winston from the former Furness Railway would be brought in to help with the goods work. A guard on Sodor, a man named Homer, maybe Homer Simpson, who knows, ran into a heaping lot of debt, so he was easily convinced to smuggle drugs onto Sodor via a goods train. Homer would be arrested and revealed that the drugs were on Gordon's train. Gordon would be taken in for questioning, momentarily arrested for a few hours while the investigations took place. Later that night, Gordon got back to the sheds just in time to hear Edward tell the others about the tales about how the Furness Railway closed in 1907. On the Skarloey Railway, the British Union of Fascists, or I shall now call them the British Union, had an incident with one of the station masters. One of the workers had used a derogatory term for David Becker, a Jewish man, the station master at Sudwin. The worker was fired because of this, but later that night, 4 men from the British Union attempted to beat up David, only to find out, really quickly, that he was a boxing champion. David was welcomed as a hero the next day on the Skarloey Railway. The attacks were frontline press, with the attackers denying that they were affiliated with the British Union at all, but the press did not believe so. The public outcry grew so severe that soon the British Union would leave Sodor, dissolving in 1940 for very obvious reasons. Due to the incident with the boulder back in 1938, Franks and Son Munitions would have to lay off a huge number of their staff, eventually downsizing and moving the operation to Krosnay-Kern on the Skarloey Railway. The SKR fleet undertook this operation with the usual complaints from Duncan. This relocation would be completed in March 1939. A few days later, Rheneas was taking a passenger train down the Skarloey Railway when his valve gear jammed. Due to the rain, one of the trees above Rheneas began to slip. So with great pain, Rheneas was able to back up, narrowly avoiding getting squashed and saving his passengers. A few days later, Percy would take Thomas's train for him, taking the Vicar's Sunday School to the beach and back. On the way back, however, a sudden storm rolled in, washing away some of the tracks just outside of Marston Heights. Percy was unable to stop in time, sliding into the very deep body of water. Diesel was nearby and teased Percy a lot about the incident. One day, the station master at Knapford, Willie Hanson, and the owner of the Sodor bus company, David Hanson, made a bet about who could get to Farquhar first, Thomas or Bertie. The race started right there, needless to say. The race caused most of the passengers to miss their stops, and Thomas and Bertie were caught speeding. Eric had allowed Thomas to pass him at Elsbridge on a red signal, violating a law about signals and blocks. A few days after this race, Mickey would find out about this, and would therefore contact Joey, and so in doing, Thomas and Bertie were arrested. The pair would get 10 days each in Railgate due to the various charges, with Eric getting 2 days home incarceration. Thomas and Bertie wouldn't be alone at Railgate, however, as Kate would pull a trick on Diesel, causing Diesel to derail at Marston Heights coal plant. Kate would therefore receive 6 days at Railgate. With the rising tensions in Europe, Sodor was called to defend itself, with 2 trains loaded with munitions and anti-aircraft guns arriving on Sodor. The first for the LNER pulled by Molly, intending to defend the west and northwest of Sodor. The second train, pulled by Peter, was intended to defend the south and east of Sodor. Eric and James were awestruck by the trains of armaments pulled by Molly, for different reasons. A new joint army-naval base was to be built on Sodor near Vickerstown, the construction being shared by the LNER and LMS. There was one minor incident when Diesel accidentally derailed a railgun, with James witnessing this. James would therefore tell the engines about what had happened to him and Amanda back on the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway back in 1917. Fort Sudrian would be opened on the 4th of July 1939, becoming a central point for docks and ships related to the Army and Navy. The 51st Vickerstown Regiment would also be based here, training regularly. Since Peter had returned to Sodor, Geoffrey was sent back to the mainland. Winston was due for his 5-year service, so Molly stayed on Sodor for the LNER to help with the goods work. One day, Gordon's whistle burst, letting out a very shrill whistling noise that couldn't be shut off for a good long while. It was only with the intervention of workmen, a ladder, and hammer was the noise finally gone. Eric and Molly's relationship began to blossom, with Diesel and Adam mocking Eric. One day, Molly tricked Adam and Diesel to take an empty train from Wellsworth to Barrow, allowing the opportunity for the LNER to swoop in and nab 2 lucrative contracts, thereby earning more money for the LNER. Lily had to explain to Gordon one day about how Douglas and her were a thing, rather than Gordon and Lily as a couple. Gordon had been outraged at first, but then heard the reasoning and mellowed out, apologising to Douglas the next day. On that same day, Henry arrived back to Sodor. Due to Henry's return, Molly and Winston would be sent back to the mainland. Every year, during the last week of August, Godred's Day, in celebration of King Godred MacHarold of Sodor, a week-long celebration is held to commemorate the special occasion. On the final day, a special engine parade is held, the specific date I'll refrain from saying just for a brief bit. Fort Sudrian acquired a new engine during this time, called Benson, who was with the ROD. Benson was a very bossy busybody, taking his authority as a military officer very seriously. The day before Godred's Day and the parade was due to take place, Kate hit a tree on the line and derailed on the main line, damaging some of the rails and sleepers. It was a tight race the next day to get the tracks fixed in time for the parade, but luckily it was able to go ahead. The parade went very successfully, with the night festivities culminating in fireworks. The LNER and LMS engines put aside their differences and enjoyed themselves this night. A good thing as well, as the day of Godred's Day would be August 31st. And considering we are in the year of 1939, I'm pretty sure you can tell what would happen the next day. Alright, wow, okay, that season was very packed, wasn't it? Covering 1938 and 1939. Victor has definitely got into his stride at this point, with pacing and the narration issues of the past being non-existent here. Honestly, a very great season, 9 out of 10. And so far, if you're looking at the episode ranking charts, this is what it looks like. Now, for the next part of the video, it does get extremely depressing, so you have been warned. On September 1st, 1939, Adolf Hitler invaded Poland with the assistance of the USSR and Stalin. On September 3rd, 1939, the UK and France declared war on Germany in return. The Second World War was about to begin, and not all the engines would survive. We have now reached the stories of war. The big four railway companies were unified into one big railway collective, the sole purpose being to supply munitions and raw materials to the front line to fight Hitler. Hitler had invaded Eastern Europe and then turned his sides onto Western Europe. On the day that France fell to Nazi Germany, Operation Chariot was put into effect, detailing the mass evacuation of civilians, mainly children, from the ports and big cities to places in the countryside, deemed less likely to be hit with German bomber attacks. Gordon, Reginald, James, and Donald had previously volunteered for the role of evacuations if Operation Chariot was put into effect, and so in June 1940, these four engines would be called upon to implement this. After a few weeks of non-stop evacuation trains, one such incident would affect the engines deeply. Ellis had burst his safety valve outside of High Bridge, and due to the size of the train, Gordon was the only one capable of pulling such a train. Not long after he left, the Germans launched a lightning plane attack on High Bridge. Gordon saw a tunnel coming and dashed inside of it. However, the back half of his train had become uncoupled, being exploded by a German bomb outside of the tunnel. 157 people died during the attack on High Bridge, 84 of whom had been on Gordon's train. On the mainland in 1941, at the town of Lofel, the Luftwaffe attacked, exploding the engine shed. The fire was getting closer to the fully laden oil train nearby, so with extreme bravery from Albert and his crew, they got the train out of there. A good thing too, as the yard office nearby had been filled with civilians hiding from the Luftwaffe attack. 30 people died on the attack on Lofel, but it would have been much worse if Albert hadn't got the oil train out of the way. Back on Sodor, a man from one of the northern towns of Sodor, Horace Fletcher, would die out at sea. Sodor would not escape the wrath of the Nazis, as one night the Luftwaffe attacked many places across Sodor at once. Henry would hide in the tunnel between Knapford and Lower Knapford, giving it the name that we all know it as today. At Knapford Station, a fully laden train of munitions was just outside the station. Colin heroically grabbed the train and ran from the station, sacrificing himself to save Diesel, Thomas, Toby, and the town of Knapford. More than 100 people died in the attack, but it could have easily been triple if the munitions train exploded. Rest in peace, Colin, 1885 to 1941, age 56. On the same night as the Blitz, Horace Fletcher's wife, Matilda, would be in her home when a bomb would strike the house, killing her instantly. This small bit about the Fletchers will become relevant towards the end of the video. Reginald, Gordon, Donald, and James were called back to Sodor to help with the repairs. At the end of 1941, the USA would be called into the war because of Pearl Harbor. Due to the help of the Americans, they began to ship engines to the UK to help with the war effort, one of these engines being Rosie, who worked at Fort Sudrian. Benson was reassigned to the Brenham docks. In 1942, the military campaign in North Africa was heating up, so much so that some of the engines were asked to go to fight the war. Thomas, Edward, Henry, Gordon, Adam, Lily, Peter, and Douglas all volunteered to fight. The group were given inbuilt radios, taught the ancient Sudric language to disguise radio communications, and were inducted into the 110th Platoon of the Steam Corps, otherwise known as the Wild Nor'Westers. Edward was given charge of the Wild Nor'Westers. While in North Africa, the Wild Nor'Westers were attacked by many German engines painted with faces designed to intimidate the enemy, which was kind of a little bit weird, but anyways, let's continue. The Wild Nor'Westers were able to repel the German engines, making use of the railguns that had been brought with them to Africa. In 1943, espionage and sabotage were found aplenty on the front line. Peter was almost killed when the bridge he was expected to cross was blown up in front of him. The lucky lamp, which had somehow come with the Wild Nor'Westers, had split Peter's train, causing him to stop before he got to said bridge, saving his life. Of course, with the lucky lamp away from the MSR, they would suffer a few incidents. The British Union was still operating, albeit in a far smaller capacity, but that wouldn't stop them from implementing their own espionage tactics. One of the men, Gus, would cause a great deal of damage on Sodor. Back on Sodor, Alfred and Geoffrey had been called in to fill the vacant spaces left by the engines of the Wild Nor'Westers. The pair still hated each other over the events that took place in 1935 back in London. Elsbridge's station master, Alexander Jeffreys, would be killed by the way of poisoning by Bobby, an associate of the British Union, who died while in an argument with Toby. With Jeffreys out of the way, a greater plan to target Sodor was made once again. Gus and Bobby would place a bomb into a train that was due for Knapford Harbour, with enough explosives to destroy a sizable portion of the docks. A workman, however, decided to check the vans randomly, discovering the bomb. Alfred was nearby, so he ran into the train and charged as far away from Knapford as he could. Unfortunately, James was passing the other way, with Mr. Starr riding in the brake van. The train passed James, but the bomb went off in front of Alfred, and next to that brake van. Alfred, the guard, and Mr. Starr were all killed by the explosion. Mr. Zorro was put in charge of Sodor's railways as a result. Rest in peace Alfred, 1911 to 1943, age 32, and rest in peace Jonathan Starr, 1887 to 1943, age 56. The British Union would be disbanded once and for all, as with the arrest of Bobby and Gus, they gave up the whereabouts of the British Union, and when it was found that they were being bankrolled by the German SS, most of its members were sentenced to execution or life in prison. The Wild Nor'westers had succeeded in Africa and were being sent to the front line in Germany in 1944, moving ever so close to Berlin. One day in 1945, Thomas and Douglas were taking a train to Heldenbergen when a sudden attack by the Germans caused them to be stuck behind enemy lines. While behind enemy lines, Thomas and Douglas came across Oliver, Toad, and Blair, as in Burke and Blair, at an abandoned factory. Toad had been converted into a radio tapper, trying to locate the whereabouts of Joseph Mengele, one of the most disgusting people ever imaginable, who experimented on people in concentration camps. And those experiments I cannot discuss here. Heldenbergen was taken back by the Wild Nor'westers, allowing for Thomas, Douglas, Oliver, Toad, and Blair to escape back to the Allied forces. While the town was being cleared, an unexploded round of ammunition was discovered. Henry tried to escape, but his safety valve went off. Lily would then sacrifice herself to save Henry, killing herself in the process. Rest in peace Lily, 1883 to 1945, age 62. A few days after Lily's death, Peter was taking a train to another town when the hospital of said town was taken captive by the Nazis, with civilians being trapped in the basement. Peter, however, saw the fact that the hospital was key to the Allied offensive, and the fact that the Nazis outweighed the civilians by 2 to 1. Peter fired a shell that would ultimately change his life, but that is for a discussion for a lot later. Word of Joseph Mengele's whereabouts stated that he might have been at Bolbrook concentration camp, so the Wild Nor'westers liberated the camp. However, Mengele escaped. Adam went to go check in one of the sheds, finding sights that I really do not want to describe. I'm pretty sure your brain, if you've seen the episode, I'm pretty sure you can figure out what he may have seen. Edward would also look in the same shed. Following the traumatic experience that they witnessed, the Wild Nor'westers were transferred to Ostend in Belgium. While in Ostend, a mistake allowed for a coach full of German POWs to enter the yard. Adam offered to shunt it onto a train going back to Germany, but instead he full speed shunted it into the sea, drowning all the men inside the coach. Due to this incident, the 110th Platoon of the Steam Corps was disbanded, and the engines were sent back to Europe. The Second World War would end on May 8, 1945 in Europe, and on September 2nd, 1945 in the Pacific. Wow, that again was very dense and was very depressing. Losing Colin, Alfred, Mr. Starr, and Lily, this is due to cause quite a few changes to this series as we go on. Stories of War is probably the best content Victor Tanzig will produce for a good while. I give it a solid 9.5 out of 10. We are now on to Season 3 with a broader sense of years, but no less impactful to the overall plot of the series. The Reverend Robert Audrey would publish the first book of the Railway series, somewhat adapting real events. This book released in 1945. 6 months after the Wild Nor'westers returned home, Edward was seeing Mickey about the nightmares that he was having after looking in the shed at Bolbrook. Adam had no remorse for his actions, and so was refusing to have the therapy sessions with Mickey. Since the war had left many people homeless, a wave of immigrants across the UK happened, finding jobs and starting lives again. Radek Zelenka would be one of these immigrants, originating from Czechoslovakia. He found work on the MSR, establishing himself as a very hard worker. We have now reached 1946, where structural reforms to rebuild Britain's railways were undertaken, the results of which would become finalised in 1948, aiming to nationalise the railways networks and the coal mines of the UK. In May 1946, Adam would be confronted by Radek over the drowning of the German POWs, as one of them had been his brother. Adam was heartbroken over this news, only finding solace once he found out that Radek's brother had technically deserved to die, for he had swindled many Czechs and Jewish people out of their fortunes during the war for his own personal gain. At Brendan's Sheds that night, the LMS crew were informed that with the absence of Colin and Lily, replacements will be brought in to help with the increasing workload. And so, in June 1946, the 2 new engines arrived. For this new established joint railway between the LNER and LMS, the old nicknames and companies being unified into a temporary one. Pickett and Samantha would be the names of the engines brought to Sodor. Some fuel tankers had had their maintenance delayed for some time, and one day when Henry was pulling the train, one of the brake blocks locked on, causing a spark and starting a fire under one of the tankers. Gordon was due to pass through, so a quick finger from Pickett, who had been passing through some milk tankers, Pickett was able to extinguish the fire with the milk. Mr. Zorro would suffer from a very nasty cough, usually disappearing for a few days at a time with sickness. It was only after a doctor's visit that he found out that he was diagnosed with lung cancer, requiring chemotherapy treatment. In his place, Basil Corbett was appointed temporary manager of Sodor's Railways. The Indians were not happy with the news of Basil Corbett's news of being temporary controller, for he was notoriously a penny pinch, being the one that had actually proposed Toby to be sold to Burke and Blair for scrap back during the pair's visit in 1938. The race for head control of Sodor's Railways would heat up as Giles Freeman would put his hat into the ring. Leaks about contracts and such would become public, causing Sodor's Railways to lose some contracts to the ever-increasing road competition. The engines suspected Giles, but nothing could ever be proven. James would crash into the rear half of Henry's goods train, just outside of Maron, due to the forgetfulness of Maron's signalman. The fallout from this incident would be noticeable, as the public fallout caused Basil to cut passenger trains and other services to stay afloat, which therefore in turn lost even more contracts to the road. A few weeks later, James would still be in the works, with the money for the repairs being very much delayed by Basil. A trick played on Samantha by Diesel about backing signals caused Samantha to derail at Lower Sudbury. The public image of Sodor's Railways deteriorated even further. The head controller for Sodor's Railways was therefore decided, being a very unlikely candidate. You may have heard of him. He was Sir Topham Hatt. The reasons for his arrival to Sodor were very interesting indeed. Basically, what had happened was that Topham had somewhat hinted at blackmail, only for this information to be leaked to the press. Following this, he had made his way to Sodor, where he would then become the controller by a landslide. This episode was initially my least favourite, but I found a new least favourite later on in the show. Due to politics in London, the Sodor Council would be created in 1946. The capital city of Sodor was decided to be Vickerstown, as that was the main entry point to Sodor. So Topham had received funding from the Sodor Council to build the Vickerstown station and Vickerstown sheds, this project going on from roughly September 1946 to April 1947, and once the project was complete, a reshuffle was instituted. Basically, this reshuffle meant that the engines built for certain tasks, i.e. express, heavy goods, mixed goods, etc., will be permanently assigned to those roles, as in the past it was sort of a whatever engine was available had to do the job, which led to general chaos. However, this structure had some teething problems, as priority for fuel trains caused other trains to be delayed, causing the flow-on effect. The railway series was gaining massive popularity around this time. However, some events happened on Sodor because of these bugs. Henry would tell Samantha about the real story of Henry's tunnel and how he hid in the tunnel to avoid the whir of the Nazi planes. Due to the influx of tourists to Sodor following the success of the railway series, the Sodor Council began to earn a lot of revenue, investing it back into the Elsbridge Airport, which will be discussed properly later in this video. Adam and Percy would get into an argument, leading to Percy accidentally coming off the rails at a set of faulty points because he was distracted. The general sentiment was that the LMS crew had seemed to be painted in a good light, being the ones that always came up on top, but there was no representation at all of the LMS in the books. The engines were getting so annoyed at the books being so fictionalized that Wilbur Audrey had to come back to Sodor to appease the engines, explaining that the books were just that, fiction. The books were designed to be for children, and so some character arcs and events were made up to appeal to younger readers, as some of the real truths would be very depressing for kids, especially considering the fact that World War II had just barely finished. Side note, there is a reference to the fact that the events of A Close Shave were 100% accurate in the books, but this of course was changed later down the line to be around the events involving Edward and Brian in 1915, so the reference at the end of this episode to A Close Shave was in fact not fully correct, but that's besides the point. Back on the mainland, WIF was becoming more and more expensive to maintain, eventually being given the three options offered to an engine: Heritage Line, being sold to another railway, or death by black water, a chemical compound able to permanently put an engine to sleep. WIF chose the fourth option, which will be discussed just a little bit later. WIF came back to Sodor to say his final goodbyes, fortunately being able to save Rosie, who was teetering on the edge after she derailed just outside of Crosby. WIF was able to hold Rosie in place until Mickey was able to arrive. It was revealed by WIF that he had signed up for target practice, as since he had been owned by the military, he decided to be of one last use for king and country. WIF gave his final goodbyes, being towed out to sea on a barge. On the Farquhar branch, they desperately needed another engine to help with the fuel deliveries to Marston Heights. At this very moment, all the engines then realised what needed to be done. The timing was incredibly close, as with a quick phone call and an intervention by 10 cents, WIF was saved. However, due to a partial communications breakdown, it had appeared that WIF had been killed by a live round. and so in doing he decided to surprise the engines roughly 10 hours after he was saved. Whiff was permanently assigned to the Far Cry branch line. December 1947 began especially busy as the businesses of Sodor rushed to send out their stock before the ports were closed due to the snow. Jeffrey was brought back once again to Sodor to help with the workload. Due to visions from Alfred and a weird shared dream into the Beyond realm, Alfred and Jeffrey were able to reconcile their differences, with Alfred mentioning that Colin, Lily, and Mr. Starr sent their regards. Henry and Douglas always had animosity surrounding the death of Lily, as she had died to save Henry. Following a few misplaced words from Henry, Douglas rammed Henry right off the track. Needless to say, this was the boiling point of a several-year-long feud. So Topham Hatt would instigate an emergency meeting with the pair, getting them to both resolve their differences around the fact that Lily had died a hero, and would have sacrificed herself for any of the other engines, be it Peter, Adam, Thomas, Edward, Gordon, hell, even Douglas himself. Douglas realised the error of his ways, apologising to Henry. A good thing as well, as just a few weeks later, a very major event in railway history would unfold. British Railways would be created on the 1st of January 1948, combining the big four railway companies into one unified company. The first part of this transition process was to nationalise the network, standardising parts to be used universally for all of the engines, greatly reducing maintenance cost. There were a few setbacks with the main network, notably with the reallocation of locomotives to regions and to trains that they were woefully underpowered for, so really, as Edward himself also describes in the series, British Railways had its pros and cons. I'm gonna presume in 1948, following an incident involving Atlas and some slate trucks, as well as a few choice words from Andreas towards Atlas, Edward told him the story of what happened with Edward and Samson in 1896. While the story at that time had no effect on Andreas, soon he would grow to accept Atlas as a proper engine, just under very dire circumstances, but that will be discussed a little later on. We are still in 1948 as a severe storm rolled over the island. Thomas and Kate were stuck at Marston Heights due to a landslide, and seeing as it didn't have another exit, the water began to rise. Mickey was quick to the scene, but the wall of mud and silt was massive. With quick thinking from a workman and Mickey, James and Donald were brought up the line, armed with snowplows. After a charge from the trio, they were able to break through the mud and save Thomas and Kate, with grumbles from James about being covered in mud, of course. 3 days later, the rain stopped and the waters receded. Marston Heights was damaged by the floodwater, but due to it being nationalised, BR paid for the repairs. Unfortunately, however, the China clay pits at Brendan would be flooded beyond all repair, and due to it being privately owned, it had to close. Neil, of course, is the engine of the China clay pits, so with its closure, Neil was left out of a job. Luckily, he was able to not be scrapped, but was sent to the Kildane scrap yard as a general shunting engine. In 1949, a very serious trial would occur for one of the engines, not Adam, but Peter. The trial was sensational, a world first of its type. The trial was around the events that happened with Peter in the hospital in 1945. Peter had originally pleaded not guilty to charges of war crimes, but with constant barraging from the prosecution, Peter had a very angry outburst saying that the civilians in the hospital had deserved to die. Needless to say, this changed the course of the trial, with Peter changing his plea to guilty. Peter was given a different sentence, different to that of regular laws for non-faceless vehicles, as Peter was given 15 years in Railgate Prison due to be released in 1964. We have now reached the new decade, with 1950 rolling around. Due to Peter's absence, Jeffrey was brought back to Sodor once again, permanently becoming another heavy goods engine, much to the relief of the other engines. What is this, the third or is it the fourth time that he has arrived back at Sodor now? Can someone let me know in the comments, please? Thank you. Due to iron ore deposits being discovered up the mountain of Coldy Fell, the Peel Gotchard Railway would begin construction, purchasing Hurricane and Pug to help with the construction work and eventual running. A viaduct was constructed, as well as a mile-long tunnel underneath the walled town of Peel Gotchard itself. The construction was going well, and after 2 years it would soft open for revenue earning services, the passenger engine purchase for the line being quite a shocking surprise. This engine was Arthur, being almost 1-to-1 the exact same engine as the one that crashed and died back in 1923, eliciting a very angry response from Edward and Toby when they first met. This new Arthur had served during the war, that being the reason why he is in LMS colours. His design would be the basis for the BR Standard 2MT. Arthur would get told the tale of the old Arthur by Edward and the ghost associated with that story in a partial capacity. In 1953, the Peel Gotchard line would open for revenue earning services, purchasing Samson to help out with additional heavy goods traffic, as with the iron ore deposits being turned into steel for general use across Sodor. The Peel Godred line would be very prosperous, but would spell the end for the MSR. A few months after the opening of the Peel Godred line, a solely tourist-focused railway began construction in approximately 1953. The yards, sheds and track to Kirkmashan would be completed in 1954. It was then found, unfortunately, that some of the company's executives had been embezzling money, so the CFR project was put on permanent hold. The autumn of 1954 would be extremely rough for the MSR, as with the opening of the Peel Godred line, goods and passenger services began to dry up. They say bad things come in threes, which ended up being the case for the MSR, as first, an avalanche happened during the launch of a new passenger service, then a line of trucks would run away on the incline at the Slate Quarry, crashing into Atlas, causing a decent bit of damage for the small engine. Andreas would help Atlas with his work while Atlas was being repaired, showing growth towards the small industrial engine. The funds began to dry up aggressively, and soon the MSR was running on fumes. There would be one final incident. The road to Peel Godred was being built, and George the Steamroller was brought to help it. One day, after a minor bit of boasting from Falcon, George ran into the train. A witness reported the incident to the police, causing the company who owned George to have to pay for the repairs. The money that the company gave to the MSR was used to pay out redundancies to the staff and secure a new home for the 6 MSR engines. And the railway that they were purchased and eventually sent to was, of course, the Skarloey Railway. The now 10-strong engine fleet would happily work side by side for a very long time. Wilbert Audrey would be present during the reallocation, drawing up some story ideas for future books. And I will note here that Falcon and Stewart would not gain their names that we know them as in the Railway series. They kept their original names of Falcon and Stewart, which I'll refer to them from here on. On the mainland in 1954, near the Rosworth Vale, Sheffield worked there. He was known as a speed demon, usually arriving 5 to 10 minutes before scheduled. One day, he had to take a train that was delayed, so naturally, he sped. He would derail, crashing into a car and killing its occupant. Sheffield would get the maximum 30 days in Railgate, and when he was let out, he went permanently slow so as to avoid derailing and killing someone with high speed. In March 1955, Walter Paxman would visit Sodor as a part of BR's gauging on how to modernise the network, intending to use Diesel's basis as the main basis for shunters across the UK. It was here where it was revealed that Diesel was called Bruce to the former LNER engines, but as stated before, I will continue to call him Diesel. Jumping forward to November 55, when winter was rolling through, a thick blanket of fog would cover Sodor, and it being an island, it would not go away anytime soon, with day fading into night. During this time, Operation Night Fleet was undertaken, determining the viability of using engines to sneak around in foggy conditions to hide from the enemy, and considering European politics at this time, it was probably quite advised. The engines of Sodor would encounter various accounts of hearing this engine, thinking that it was a ghost of some kind. Notably James, who thought that the sound of it sounded very familiar to the sound that Dominic would make when he was causing his antics way back when. After too many sightings, the operation was deemed to be a failure. Edward told the engines about how he had been sworn to secrecy, as since he had been a commanding officer during the war, he was allowed to see the classified experiment, as well as the fact that he was at Brendan when the thing arrived, but that's besides the point. The engines never did quite figure out the true reason behind the purpose of Operation Night Fleet, but this would soon be forgotten as 1956 rolled around, a very big year for Sodor in terms of history. So that was Season 3 from 1946 to 1955, and I will say that the start of the season was a bit slow, but it quickly picked up, being an entertainable one. The camera work has notably changed, as well as general pacing and narration work. I'd give this season an 8 out of 10 if asked. 1956 would see BR's modernisation plan, aimed at strengthening the railways and upgrading them to the latest standard. This involved cutting branch lines that were deemed unprofitable, the loop line on Sodor falling into this category. Barrow would gain a new station pilot, a rough engine called Sheffield. However, he seemed to move incredibly slowly for reasons of his own past, causing many trains to be delayed while at Barrow. Jeffrey would be involved in an accident due to faulty signalling. Oh my god, now he's leaving again? Oh my god, can he just stay please for once? Murdoch, a BR Standard 9F, was brought to Sodor to help out with the goods work. He was quick to point out that Sodor was mainly being run by engines from the Second World War, causing some tension with some engines, Henry in particular. Murdoch, of course, would overdo himself attempting to take a very long train up Gordon's Hill. Even with Reginald as a banker, the train stalled. Henry was brought in to assist. That night in the shed, Murdoch would explain on how he was indeed the prototype for the BR Standard 9F, and was wanting to prove himself so he didn't end up on the scrap heap. Henry understood, explaining to the other engines why Murdoch acted the way he did. After a month or so, Jeffrey would be repaired, so Murdoch was sent back to the mainland, having a long and fulfilling career. In 1956, funding would be supplied for the CFR, allowing construction to continue on the line up the Caldyfell Mountain. The rolling stock was to be built by the Skarloey Railway, and 4 engines would be purchased from the Snowdon Mountain Railway. These engines were Alaric, Wilfred, Harry, and Ernest. Construction would continue up the mountain, and towards the early stages of 1957, the station of Devil's Back was reached. A soft opening was held at Devil's Back as a tour guide group wished to ride on the railway. While at Devil's Back, one of the guides would tell the story about King Godred and Caldy. The story states that Caldy was a tyrant of Sodor back in the 11th century, with King Godred killing him. But when a rumour about Caldy's return surfaced, King Godred went to fight him, locked in eternal combat for all of eternity. But of course, this story was slightly changed later on about the dates, but I'll discuss that a little later on. A local reporter was in the tour group for the CFR, publishing a glowing review of the experience in mid-1957. The influx of tourists because of this caused the Peel Godred line to become heavily inundated, causing Sir Topham Hatt to purchase a new engine, Cuthbert. Cuthbert was from Australia, designed to take long goods trains across the Australian hills and deserts. British Railways around this time was investing in moving money between banks via rail, as trains could carry a lot more than trucks. Needless to say, crooks and would-be robbers would seize the opportunity attempting to rob the trains. Jackson Bailey, Sodor's resident folkman, we finally got back to him, let's go, would stop one of these attempts, having had word from his grandson. Jackson was a strong fighter, quickly disposing of the would-be robbers. Cuthbert was then revealed to be the notorious gangster Johnny Cuba, but before the cops could arrest him, he seemingly disappeared, having stolen a few trains while on Sodor, much to the annoyance of the Peel Godred line, who had trusted him, notably Arthur. Since Johnny Cuba had escaped, leaving the Peel Godred line without another engine, Molly was brought to Sodor, allowing her to catch up with Eric. The China clay pits at Brendonwood decided to have been a decent enough money earner from back in the day, so BR decided to reopen the line with new rails and facilities planned to be built. Bill and Ben would be purchased to operate on the line, as their smaller height allowed them to enter the small tunnel at the pits. The pits reconstruction would take a few months, and soon 1958 would roll around, and with this year we see the end of Adam. Adam would have a quite severe case of metal fatigue, with cracks in his boiler ever increasing. The procedure to repair metal fatigue is a very risky process, as not everyone who undertakes this procedure survives. Adam then decided at this moment to request the final firing, the process to end an engine's life using black water. Adam would take the black water in the company of Sir Topham Hatt, Diesel, Edward, and Mr. Zorro, peacefully dying. Rest in peace Adam, 1882 to 1958, age 75. In 1958, the CFR reached the summit, establishing a station roughly 50 metres below the summit of the mountain itself. With Adam's death, Donald was transferred to the Brendon branch, leaving a vacant space on the main line. Joshua, a Class 42 warship prototype from BR, arrived on Sodor. He was a good worker, although he had some prejudices around steam engines, claiming that he was the future. Typical diesels. Another prototype was sent to the Brendon branch, a Class 28 Metropolitan Vickers Type 2 diesel electric. His name was Boko. While Joshua was a success, the experimental engine unit that Boko had caused a great deal of grief for the engine. BR would insist that it was just teething troubles, continuing to put him on progressively longer and longer trains. Joshua would be transferred elsewhere on the mainland, so Boko was assigned to do the jobs that Joshua had done. This included pulling the express. One day, Boko's engine failed, so Henry had to help him. When they got to Maron, Henry stopped as he saw an engine from his past holding an excursion train. This engine was Emily, and it was revealed that night that she and Henry were married. The marriage had occurred on the former GNR where the pair worked, as they had gotten a priest to officiate the relationship. Boko's repairs would take longer than expected, so Emily was temporarily assigned to the main line. After questioning from several of the engines, Sheffield would finally reveal on why he moved so slow as the Barrow Station pilot. He told a story about how the last time he had speed, he killed a man back in 1954. Following his story, he finally began to work at normal speed, bringing Barrow Station Yard back to peak efficiency. Boko would be sent back to the mainland to the manufacturer to sort all of the faults with the Class 28s, so Emily became a permanent addition to the NWR, an arrangement that Emily and Henry were quite pleased with indeed. The airport at Elsbridge was up and running by 1958, being incredibly popular with more people being able to arrive on Sodor. Howard would arrive on Sodor, becoming the part of the fire and rescue service, as you could get to accident scenes faster than Mickey. A Class 40 prototype named Theodore would arrive on Sodor aimed at running the post train, but due to his engine seizing up, his trial failed and Emily was assigned to be running the post trains from then on. In the opening months of 1959, a television documentary about Sodor was made, detailing how Sodor operated. It would also mention the tale of King Godred and the crown that apparently would grant immortality if you wore it. This would lead of course to a spate of robberies and vandalism across Sodor. Barry McKinley, brother of Tom McKinley, the former founder and leader of the Sodor British Union, hired Stan and Kenny to dig up a crate. The crate was on Sean Hainsley's estate, a local politician to the area. The crate contained documents of every single member of the British Union having been hidden during the Second World War. Like, why would you put it in a crate and then just hide it somewhere? Like, you just burn that. Anyways, Stan and Kenny thought that they were being led on by McKinley, having not been paid for digging up the crate. They then decided to rob the post train, which was being pulled by Jeffrey. The Lucky Lamp was on the tracks at this current moment, stopping Jeffrey and allowing for Old Man Bailey to fight Stan and Kenny. Stan and Kenny were arrested, singing like canaries about their crimes, and Barry McKinley allowing for him to be arrested. The crate was discovered and the documents became public, leading to further arrests of the UK of former British Union members. In 1959, the French ambassador would visit Sodor, bringing along his dog, a German shepherd, named Fifi. They would visit the completed China clay pits, but Fifi ended up escaping the ambassador. Incidents involving mauled sheep cropped around the area, but with help from Bill, Fifi was returned back to the ambassador and cleared of any wrongdoing. So that was Season 4 Part 1, covering 1955 to 1959. A fairly uneventful season, but the beginnings of some big changes on Sodor. Some of the stories were great, some of them not so. So I'd give this half season like a 7.5 out of 10, and this is what the rankings look like so far. We are now in the 1960s, and its first year was quite eventful for Sodor. On the northwest side of the island, an oil processing depot was to be built at the town of Waterton, intending for oil ships to dock there, transfer the fuel into the tanker wagons, and the fuel to be shipped to the mainland. Oliver and Duck were brought to Sodor, becoming the main engines for the new branch line. Construction of the line north from Tidmouth went well, passing the main line to Islesborough, but of course this did not go entirely fully well when Oliver ended up in the turntable well. Because of this gap in the roster, Diesel volunteered to help with the construction, as well as to try and repair his reputation with Duck and Percy, both of whom he had yet to apologise to before now. Which, Duck I can understand because you haven't seen him that often, but Percy, like, surely you could have at least apologised to him, like, literally any time up to this point. Anyways, tensions between the trio would ramp up, reaching a boiling point when Scruffy sang the song with the other trucks that had been sung about Diesel back in 1931. Diesel was outraged by this, and finding out that Duck told him the song, he set out to find the Great Western engine. He rammed into Duck, who rammed into Percy, causing the cranes to hit various trains at Tidmouth Halt. Diesel would apologise to Percy and Duck at the sheds that night after realising that the project was far more important than petty rivalries. Percy and Duck would accept the apology, but Diesel would still receive 30 days incarceration. Also, briefly, Gregory Hall would be found murdered by gunshot in 1960, but I'm sure this isn't foreshadowing at all of what's to follow. On the Skarloey Railway, expansion was in progress. There was a big rock ridge separating the Skarloey Railway and the Nartwin Valley, but with the help of dynamite, this was completed in early 1961. With the ridge opened up, the expansion made its way into the valley itself. Rusty was purchased for the Skarloey Railway to help with the expansion. Needless to say, Duncan took extreme prejudice against Rusty on the basis that Rusty was a diesel. The Skarloey Railway would reach the famous standing stones of Sodor. While at the site, Rusty supposedly saw the Nartwin, a Sasquatch-looking creature, very large and covered in hair. The Nartwin Express was formed from the multiple sightings, framed as a Nartwin hunt of sorts, and it was quite successful, generating a lot of revenue for the railway. The Franks and Sons Dynamite Company would keep churning out dynamite for the expansion, but the new supervisor was less than subpar, as he had a habit of barely looking at the dynamite that he was tasked with making sure was secure. As well as the fact that he was technically a nepotism baby because his father was someone higher up in the things, you know, like that all kind of shtick. One day, Andreas was due to pick up a dynamite train from the company, but his driver was feeling ill. At Andreas' request, his driver went to the hospital, and Andreas ran crewless with his train. And this is a part that I kind of didn't mention before, but yeah, the engines can run crewless. The train became uncoupled just beyond the ridge, without Andreas noticing. Although, how do you not notice that? Duncan had been coming up the line when he derailed in the gorge, with Rusty pulling him back onto the rails. The unattended train would explode due to improper handling of the dynamite, causing a rock slide. Duncan being unable to move, Andreas shot forward, pushing Duncan out of the way, but unfortunately Andreas would be killed by a very large rock.
Rest in peace Andreas, 1916 to 1961, age 45. The expansion continued and we have now reached the winter of 1961. One day, Stuart forgot to secure his trucks at the top of a hill, allowing them to run away and derail on the old iron bridge, plunging down and crushing what was thought to be a young bear cub. The consequences from this accident would end up being quite severe for the Skarloey Railway. A workman was killed and the work hut was completely destroyed. But by what? Theories began to range from a bear to a serial killer, but the most common was that the Naatwin had done it. One night some hunters went out to go and kill what was ever behind these attacks. Most of them were killed however, but one of them was able to escape with the help of Ivo Hugh, the pair seeing the creature albeit from a distance. The army would be called in as a result, setting up checkpoints and regular patrols along the Skarloey Railway, hoping to capture and or kill the creature that was killing these people. One day, the military were chasing the creature, speeding along the country lanes. Unfortunately for Duncan, the truck being used crashed right into him, derailing and causing damage to him. He would be in the works for quite a while. The military would blame Duncan for the incident, with Duncan conveniently having amnesia forgetting the incident. And I put this here because technically there's enough information as stated in the ECPs of Sodor that these two events are basically the same. Of course it could have just been a random truck, but again this is a little bit of a headcanon. Anyways, when Duncan didn't return that night, Ivo Hugh, Skarloey, Rusty went up the line to try and find him, fearing that the creature had gotten Duncan. A fog rolled in, and with no sightings of Duncan, the group began to go back down the line, when the creature ran in front of them, being chased by Old Bailey. Of course, he denied ever being there, but Rusty and Rheneas, who saw it happen, always believed that he had been there that night. The thing that had been causing the mayhem was revealed to be a bear angry about her dead cub, but not everyone believed that story. By 1962, the Skarloey Railway reached the town of Harwin, completing the extension up the Naatwin Valley. A few slate quarries would be constructed around the Naatwin Valley itself. It would be revealed by Benson that the Lucky Lamp wasn't any special lamp, just a regular issue ROD lamp, and since it was technically military equipment, Benson confiscated it. After an investigation, it was found to actually have been Benson's headlamp, and because it hadn't been written off during the First World War, he valiantly returned it back to Stanley. There was a boulder of similar shape to the boulder that had blocked the main line back in 1938 at one of the slate quarries. One day, after an onslaught of rain, the boulder fell down onto the tracks, chasing after Falcon and Rheneas. The boulder would roll down the line until the town of Harwin, where it went into a siding and crashed into a train of dynamite, destroying the boulder. Sir Handel Brown and Sir Topham Hatt were nearby and came to the accident scene. Stanley said that it was lucky that no one was hurt in this incident, as he had the lucky lamp aboard his train. Sir Topham Hatt had always heard about this fabled lamp, but he got quite a nasty shock when he opened up one of the vans. The reasons for this was because this was the exact same lamp that had saved him back in 1917 and indirectly got him sent to the hospital at Carlton, where he was experimented on by Wesley Anderson. Needless to say, the repressed memories came flooding back quick, and Sir Topham Hatt left the area quickly as well. Sir Topham Hatt would be plagued by memories of Dr. Anderson, seeing him when others couldn't. It got so bad that Topham's wife recommended him to a psychiatrist to talk about what had been happening to him recently. Duncan had returned to the Skarloey Railway sporting a yellow paint livery, similar to that of Andreas, raising a few questions. One day he would meet a former workman of the Barnhill Railway, Duncan trying to keep it quiet of course. After questioning for some of the engines however, he would tell a story about how the Barnhill Railway was quite corrupt and very unsafe, leading Duncan to adopt the attitude of being quite gruff, overworked, quite rude over the last 30 years. So Topham Hatt would go to the old site of the Carlton Hospital, speaking with the ghost of Wesley Anderson. Anderson would therefore explain at this current moment that he had done the wrong thing, willingly given up his license and begged for jail back in 1918, because he was technically ordered to by the government at that time to find a cure for all of the mental illnesses, because again, back in those times, it was kind of one of those things how you kind of could cure it just instantly. Of course, that is BS now, but you kind of know how it kind of was back then. So Topham Hatt would realize what Anderson was saying, and decided to forgive him for his actions. Which myself personally, I would not forgive him, but go off. So Topham Hatt wished to have the lucky lamp in his office, but the problem was the lamp went missing around this time. The whereabouts of it today are currently unknown, but theories did surround about where it could have gone. The lamp would never appear on Sodor in the main timeline as of this video. The military on Sodor would downsize their operations, closing Fort Sudrian and migrating up the Naatwin Valley, setting up Camp Coldy near the Harwin Slate Quarry. This opened in 1962. With the closure of Fort Sudrian, Rosie was expected to be reallocated to Southampton Docks, but she was purchased by Sir Topham Hatt, much to the delight of James and Rosie. However, because James and Rosie can't ever be together, she was reassigned to the Brendan branch. Damn, so close, you guys could have been like Romeo and Juliet, now you're across the island. RIP. Randolph, the brother of Reginald, would come to the island hauling a rail tour. He had volunteered for the tour to see Reginald and hopefully make amends for what had happened back in London. The story goes that Randolph, who had been envious of the praise that Reginald kept getting, had started to pass a rumour back during the 1930s that Reginald had not fancied females. A rumour that was quite damaging back then. Randolph was apologetic for this, but Reginald wouldn't hear any of it. Needless to say, the relationship was very rocky indeed. Due to a fault with BR signalling, Randolph would crash into Edward, causing Edward's boiler to crack and putting the engine into a coma-like state. Randolph would then derail the next day on a set of points, his own boiler cracking. But unlike Edward, it was found that Randolph had a quite severe case of mental fatigue, worse than Adam's case. Reginald would try to save Randolph, requesting Mickey to give Randolph a complete overhaul. Unfortunately, Randolph never woke up, causing quite a great deal of grief for Reginald. Samantha would try and help Reginald overcome the grief, so it was little shock when he asked her to marry him. Edward would get a new boiler and will return to regular service, being able to attend the impromptu wedding ceremony. Dr. Richard Beeching, chairman of BR, would arrive on Sodor in 1963. He was notorious for closing down economically unsustainable parts of BR, and on Sodor, various places were found and closed. These included Carlton Yard, Crosby Yard, Lower Knapford, and the oil depot. Elsbridge Harbour would also be closed, along with various goods stations that were deemed unprofitable. The Far Cry branch line would end up being the least profitable of the branch lines on Sodor, so Beeching was expected to close it down. This wasn't good news, however, not since the Innova quarry needed a stone crusher that could only be moved by rail to stay operational. The engines of the Far Cry branch would unknowingly prove to Beeching that the line was useful after getting the crusher up the line and through the dip, a stretch of track that had been lowered to try and stop runaway trucks from the quarry. This will come back into play a little later on. This wouldn't stop Beeching, however, from closing the branch, but with stone trains becoming more and more profitable, the branch line was redesignated as an industrial line. This was also done due to a bit of persuasion, as on Sir Topham Hatt's desk was a copy of the Railway Series book Branch Line Engines, so Sir Topham Hatt had slyly stated that Beeching shouldn't close down Thomas's branch line. This doesn't make quite a lot of sense, however, as the book was released in 1961, yet Daisy appeared in that book, but she is yet to appear on Sodor. So life imitates art, or Wilbert Audrey is a time traveller. Barrow Station and yard workers would go on strike, meaning that rail traffic couldn't make its way to Sodor, now having to come in via sea. Johnny Cuba would arrive at Barrow with a stolen MOD train filled with weapons and munitions, intending to sell it on to the IRA. Unfortunately, with the strike, he couldn't unload his train at Barrow, so he had to go to Sodor and unload at the recently closed Fort Sudrian. Joey would somehow not recognise Johnny Cuba until it was too late, being knocked off the rails by the criminal engine. Johnny Cuba would use odd mind powers to be able to lower the Vickerstown lift bridge and change the points, arriving at the fort. Arthur would also somehow end up at the fort as well, confronting Johnny Cuba. Johnny Cuba would make some threats at the engine, convincing Arthur to steal some coal trucks so Johnny Cuba could leave the train at the docks for an IRA ship to dock and load it, and Johnny Cuba could make yet another escape. Princess Alice, a large passenger ship, would be damaged at sea and would dock at the soon-to-be-closed Elsbridge Harbour. The storm that had been predicted was far worse than imaginable, bucketing down dramatically. The passengers from the Princess Alice were reallocated across Sodor, though with Henry's train blocked, most of the mainline engines were blocked from trying to help out with this endeavour, so most of the trains were running very full, but with very few engines to help. A particularly long train just about stalled on Gordon's Hill, but with the assistance of Arthur, it was able to get across the hill. Arthur would stand up to Johnny Cuba, and with the help of Edward, Johnny Cuba was derailed and arrested. He apparently sang like a canary, giving up a lot of his criminal associates. But then he just disappeared for good, with theories ranging from being deported back to Australia or being executed by Blackwater, but this was still the end of him. Also presumably around this time frame, Helen Dobson would disappear under mysterious circumstances involving a car. Elliot Dobson was the main suspect, but nothing could be proven by Joey. We have now reached 1964 when dieselisation began to ramp up dramatically. It started with a new OH shunter for Barrow Yard, meaning that Sheffield had to be reassigned to the Waterton branch. A Class 17 diesel named Derek was the next to arrive, being assigned to the Farquhar branch. However, his engine meant that he couldn't handle gradients above 1 in 100, so he was also reassigned to the Waterton branch as the gradients were almost non-existent on that part of the line. However, Derek would struggle there as well. But after an engine repair at the Crovensgate workshops, he would become the secondary fire and rescue engine, a job that suited him perfectly. A Class 46 diesel named Francis would arrive shortly thereafter, being assigned to the main line, excelling in his jobs. Unfortunately, his personality was far from excellent, being a very snobbish engine that only wanted to pull the express. A Class 07 named Salty would be assigned to the Brendan branch, excelling as Brendan Doc Shunter, being a very pleasant chap with many a pirate tale to tell. The final diesel to arrive was Daisy, a diesel rail car aimed to run stopping commuter trains. She was snobbish like Francis, but she soon learned sense. Francis would fall into a ditch next to the Vickerstown sheds after running off the turntable. Francis would be reassigned following this incident, occasionally coming back to Sodor with rail tours. Brian, an old brake van from the former Railsworth and Sudbury Railway, would return to Sodor, a shock for Edward as Brian had saved his life back in 1915. Brian of course is the sole survivor of the Railsworth and Sudbury Railway. Brian would come in a train pulled by Boko, a much different engine. He had been in the Cravensgate works for a brief bit, the workmen fixing all of his faults, making Boko a strong diesel as he was designed to be. To top the day off, Peter arrived back on Sodor having served his 15-year sentence for the shelling of the hospital in 1945. Gordon was quite angry at seeing Peter again, so angry in fact that when tensions flared up, the pair had to go and see Mickey to get to the bottom of the problem. They will resolve their differences about the fact that in war the circumstances of incidents involving the pair were mutual, with the pair understanding how the other one felt about what they did. Godred's Day in 1964 would mark the 1000th anniversary of King Godred and Coldy the Tyrant's battle back in 964. The Waterton branch would gain 2 more engines, Wendell and William, giving the reasoning as to why the Waterton branch is better known as the Little Western. To round out 1964, Old Bailey would be approached and arrested by the SCP Foundation, being hinted to be the immortal King Godred. This could potentially explain a few things, as he had been a fogman on the Mid-Sodor Railway, which again had opened back in 1882. We also learn here that the Nar twin, otherwise known as Croven, had been apparently killed by the SCP Foundation back in 1961. Wow, okay, that is most certainly a cliffhanger. To make things simple, I'm going to make the next section of this video solely dedicated to the SCPs of Sodor miniseries, as events may or may not have happened. Season 4 Part 2 covered 1960 to 1964, and wow was it an improvement. I enjoyed this one quite a lot. I'd give this season maybe an 8.5 out of 10 if asked. In 964, a major battle between King Godred and Coldy the Tyrant raged, with a man escaping. He would come across a man and a woman within the Standing Stones, clearly out of their time. Although this was the believed tale of Godred and Coldy, Victor recently revealed that this might not be 100% the case, but I'll discuss this in a short while. In 1917, Corporal Kyle Proteus would work with Benson and Stanley on the Western Front in France, quickly gaining a reputation for being incredibly lucky. One day, as he was taking an ammunition train to Mont-Saint-Beer, a tree was on the line in front of him and a German shell exploded the train, killing Kyle. Kyle's spirit would levitate to the one sole surviving object of the disaster, a solitary lamp. That lamp was of course the lamp that Sir Topham Hatt would take back with him to Sodor. In Australia in 1935, Johnny Cuba would be created with a group of people chanting in an unknown language, and then the group was struck by lightning at the same time. The engine in the centre of the ritual would become non-faceless, with supernatural abilities. In 1945, we found out that Peter had a brother, Agent Alan Lang, but note the had. Alan was expected to take a train in Germany, doing so easily, but a problem arose. Johnny Cuba would use his telepathic powers to disconnect the train and teleport in front of it and escape with the train, derailing Alan as he fled. Over the coming years, Johnny Cuba would go around the world teleporting in and out of various countries and stealing trains. By 1956, Alan would finally chase Cuba into a siding when the latter would derail, being arrested by the SCP Foundation. But when they put him back onto the rails, he would disappear. The theory proposed then was that Cuba got his powers from the rails, so if he derailed again, he wouldn't be able to disappear. In 1957, on the slopes of Caldy Fell, 2 hikers would hear a mysterious wailing noise. The noise seemed to originate from a cave with ancient Sudric text. One of the hikers went into the cave, the wailing noise came again, and an entity flew from the cave. And I'm going to call them entities as we never do see what they look like. All we know is that the sound it makes and the direction it leaves from the cave. The other hiker ran away, alerting the authorities, who would therefore alert the SCP Foundation. The area would be contained and a monitoring station would be set up by the mouth of the cave. Dr. Gwen Hatley would arrive, as she had history with translating ancient texts. She would be greeted by Rodney Pierce, the leader of the Sodor branch of the SCP Foundation. Gwen would also join Dr. Angus Murphy to decipher the text on the cave entrance. As Gwen would decipher the text above the cave, it stated, "If life enters before its time, the dead will return." A group of prisoners, otherwise known as D-Class, were sent into the cave, armed with sensors and radars, but the prisoners would enter and entities would fly out. One of these D-Class prisoners was called D5702, otherwise known as Bobby Cooper. he was sent into the cave, meeting the same fate as everyone else before him. The trials would go on until 1958. Gwen would happen to spot Boko when he had been on Sodor the first time, noticing the number D5702. She, an army officer named Gavin Potter, and Rodney Pierce would question Boko about his history, finding out that his name was apparently indeed Bobby Cooper. This seemed to support a new theory that the people who went into the cave came out as either former spirits or new engines. In 1959, following the arrest of Barry McKinley and exposure of the British Union, Gavin Potter would come across a piece of paper during one of the arrests, pocketing it and giving it to Gwen. Gwen would translate the text, giving directions starting from the standing stones. The directions would lead to a spot that, after a bit of digging, would contain a crate. Inside this crate were diamonds, but not just any diamonds, but those stolen from Whiff's train back in 1901 in South Africa. On the Skarloey Railway, Stanley would say the full name of Kyle Proteus next to the lamp, summoning a physical spirit of Kyle, much to the shock of everyone. Gavin and Gwen happened to witness this, but when Gavin picked up the lamp, Kyle would disappear back into the lamp. Following a chat with Kyle and the SCP Foundation, Kyle would disappear for good, evading the Foundation and saving those who aren't so lucky. The cave and the hiking trails up to the top of Coldie Fell were banned sometime in 1960, as the SCP Foundation saw no more benefit to the trials, but this didn't stop some people. In 1961, we see the other side of Stewart's train running away and falling off the old iron bridge, seeing as it crushed a Nartwin, who we later learn was called Harwin. Croven, the name of the main Nartwin, would witness this, attacking the Skarloey Railway. The SCP Foundation would be brought in under the guise of being part of the military, tasked with capturing Croven. One day after a few attacks, there would be a sighting of Croven, and the SCP Foundation gave chase. This truck would end up crashing into Duncan and injuring the crew and the engine. Croven escaped. The Foundation would continue to chase Croven, encountering him in the fog. Old Bailey would appear from nowhere, fighting the military men and allowing for Croven to escape. This would be for nothing, however, as the next day Croven would be captured during the day. Croven was then supposedly killed, and with that, the Nartwin species went extinct, or so it was thought. In 1963, Cuba would be summoned once again. The ritual to summon Cuba was to kill a family member, then carve the letters WAGR into their face. Two men, one of them with a terminal illness, would initiate this ritual, summoning Cuba. Cuba would be tasked by the man to rob an MOD supply train, intending to send it onwards to the IRA. Cuba would take the opportunity of Theodore breaking down and stole the train. This train was a sting operation though, and soon the military and the railway police would be chasing after Cuba. Cuba would be chased across the Rosworth Vale region, eventually coming to a bridge. Ellen charged at Cuba and a scuffle ensued. But Cuba was too strong and Ellen was pushed off the bridge, killing the ATF. Cuba would escape to Sodor, where he was derailed by Arthur. The Foundation would catch up to Cuba, intending to ship him overseas to their main facility for experimentation. Green water would be administered, but due to a mix-up, black water was apparently introduced to Cuba's system, killing the gangster. In 1964, a workman on the Waterton branch would uncover a skeleton and an ancient stone with ancient Sodric written on it. The skeleton was thought to be that of King Godred, which would line up with the fact that the stone was known in legend as the Rock of Godred. The rock would lead the Foundation back to the Standing Stones. The text on the rock was partially translated as "Open wide the gates of," with the last word missing. After deduction, Angus would say the final word was time, and so when you put the whole thing together, "Open wide the gates of time," the stones then opened up at that moment, teleporting Gwen and Angus through time. They would encounter a T-Rex, aliens attacking Earth, and then a very young Jackson Bailey, who knew how to use the Standing Stones. After sending them away to a very nice peaceful time, it was revealed to Gwen and Angus that Old Bailey was actually Coldie the Tyrant, as Fogman in ancient Sudric directly translated to Cold D. The Foundation would capture Old Bailey, it being revealed that he would later join them. At that moment, someone else came through the Standing Stones, a Mr. Jonathan Starr, otherwise known as King Godred. As stated by Victor recently, apparently Godred, as I will momentarily refer to him, was effectively a time traveller. He used the Standing Stones to look into the future constantly, eventually falling in love with a woman roughly in the 1930s. It was here that he rescinded his throne and became Jonathan Starr. To mirror Godred, Goldie took the form of a human, aka Jackson Bailey. The latter would become a part of the SCP Foundation, whereas Godred's involvement is a bit messy. See, he apparently foresaw himself exploding in 1943 and so apparently teleported away from there. But this raises a question about the bodies, plural, found in the wreckage, so I really have no clue how he was able to teleport away. At least Coldie Coldy/Bailey can teleport by the fog, as is established, but Godred/Star can't just teleport like that. I don't know, it doesn't exactly line up. Like, I guess you can kind of think a bit about like how he's able to just turn up at the sheds. Victor then states that the exact moment he teleported away was when we would see the SCP Foundation finally encountering him, the cliffhanger ending of the episode initially. Coldy and Godred would then work together for the SCP Foundation. In 1991, Camp Coldy would close down, being hinted to be the SCP's main base on Sodor, but nothing has been confirmed as of recording. In 2015, after Edward told the story about the Path of the Dead, a man would enter the cave, with the spirit of Dominic appearing on Gordon's Hill in front of Douglas's train. In 2015 as well, after Edward told the story about how fortune favours the lucky, Stanley on the Skarloey Railway would be saved from a large rock falling onto the tracks by an unseen lamp, and Carl Proteus. In 2015 finally, after Edward told the story of the Nartwin, a Nartwin was run over by a lorry on the Skarloey Railway, this being witnessed by a tribe of Nartwins. That night, the tribe went to one of the towns, absolutely causing chaos by murdering everyone in sight. And oh my lord, okay, that was certainly an eye-opener. I personally believe these tales to be canon to the stories of Sodor, but I can understand if some of you guys don't believe these to be canon. It is a bit of a shame that there won't be a season 2 of this, as confirmed by Victor himself, but oh well, I guess it's better to have a one-hit wonder than 15 seasons travelling to mediocrity. We have 2 more seasons to cover, folks, just hang in there. Back to the SCPs of Sodor, I'll give it a 9 out of 10. Yeah, I'm biased, but I enjoyed it. We have now reached 1965, a year that would change a lot on Sodor for better and for certainly for worse, and this is a momentary viewer's discretion warning, as the latter half can get quite depressing indeed. The Waterton branch was open and doing roaring trade around this time, but it was hit with a spate of vandalism. Peter would be the target of some of this vandalism, having statements and logos put onto his tender, symbols that I can't really say or show on YouTube, but do revolve around him being a war criminal. We meet Robert Hall, the new superintendent at Crovensgate Workshops. He hints that he remembers seeing Donald when he was a young boy, as his father had been a guard for the former LMS. Okay, and this is some nice foreshadowing. I bet you guys probably already know the twist by now, but let's keep going. The turntable at the sheds would be targeted, being jammed, with only Jeffrey being able to leave the sheds. He would offer to take the flying kipper for Henry, and that act would doom himself. A pipe would be placed on the rails below Gordon's Hill, and Jeffrey would not stand a chance. He hit the pipe and careened down the side of the embankment, killing himself and his crew. Rest in peace, Jeffrey, 1934 to 1965, age 31. Derek, Mickey, and Robert Hall would arrive on the scene, pronouncing Jeffrey as dead, with Derek delivering the bad news to the rest of the mainline fleet. The real culprit of Jeffrey's murder would just be getting started, however. A road bridge between the Sodor and mainland would be completed the day of Jeffrey's death, allowing for increased competition from the roads. Soon, the railways began to lose more and more goods contracts to the roads. On the Waterton branch, a new lorry was purchased called Onslow. He was quite smug about being in service, while the Waterton branch saw trains of goods being cancelled left, right and centre. A new double-decker bus named Boldly was brought to the Waterton branch as well, single-handedly taking most of the passenger traffic by himself. George had been making his way around the island, destroying the areas that Beeching had closed back in '63, ending up on the Waterton branch during 1965. George and Oliver apparently had a previous history together, one that had ended with a minor accident involving the pair at a level crossing. The next day, in a stroke of ironic coincidence, Onslow would break down on a level crossing, George being behind him. After some threatening from Oliver, George decided to ride on the rails and charge at Oliver. Oliver then somehow uncoupled from his train and charged at Oliver, with obvious results coming from this. Oh my god, George just keeps getting involved in accidents involving level crossings, doesn't he, in this series and other series. George would be sent away from Sodor because of this, spending the rest of his days building motorways across the UK. Boldly would end up taking Duck's passengers one day, using a shortcut that he had heard about. Unfortunately for him, the height of the bridge was lower than the height of Boldly, with obvious results coming from this as well. Boldly would be sent away because of this, his whereabouts unknown at the time of recording, likely turned into a henhouse. Onslow would stay on Sodor, having changed his personality, becoming a far more pleasant chap. With the new road bridge over the Walney Channel, more people were able to visit the island than ever, some of the enthusiasts taking photos of the engines by trespassing on the rail line. One day, Emily had to stop due to faulty brakes on some of the trucks, and Avery Halifax pulled up and took some photos of her. Halifax was rich, so he was able to pay off the coppers and the engine crews to turn a blind eye to his trespassing. Wilbur Audrey would return to Sodor to mark the 20th anniversary of the railway series. He would take part in a new venture, a ride with the reference train, where he would ride on the express and passengers could do a live meet and greet. The trucks up at Marston Heights coal mine had their brakes locked up, so very old trucks had to be used for a very important order. Emily would pull this train up Gordon's Hill as James made his way down with a reference train. Just before Emily made it to the top, one of the truck couplings snapped, allowing half the train to roll back down the hill. Mr. Halifax would be at the base of the hill, filming James being on the tracks to get his precious photo. James would wheeze him, covering him in a cloud of steam. Halifax was partially blinded by this, not seeing the runaway train until it was too late. He was killed instantly. Halifax's family would sue the Marston Heights coal mine, leading to its closure, but I'll discuss that a little later on. On the Scar Lower Railway, presumably around this time, the Boxford Ballast Mine began to run out of stone, slowly causing trains to be shorter and shorter. Which, how do you run out of stone at a ballast mine? Just open up a new hill. Anyways, Neil was working at the Kildane scrapyard when one day a rather odd incident occurred. Neil was told to go to a recently occupied siding and move it to the scrap line. He would bump into a very rusted engine, awakening it from an apparent coma. The rusted engine's name was Barry. The records showed that Barry had moved around scrapyards across the UK since 1958, ending up in the condition that we see him as when we first meet him. Barry would be transferred to Crovansgate Works for restoration, with Robert Hall proposing to use the engine in an unusual experiment. Before Barry's overhaul could begin, the alarm rang. Henry would derail quite severely, which also killed his crew and greatly damaged himself. His condition would be the equivalent of a critical in our terms, but the supply of new parts was delayed. To keep Henry alive, Robert Hall would propose to use scrap parts to momentarily keep Henry's condition stable. Luck could be on their side as a soon-to-be scrapped faceless engine had most of the parts in common with Henry. The parts were substituted and Henry would stay in the works, as the new parts finally arrived a few days later. Barry, who had been inspired by Robert Hall's work, decided to agree to the unusual experiment that Robert had wanted to attempt. The specifics of this experiment I'll discuss a little later on. The fallout from Halifax's lawsuit on Marston Heights would end up closing the coal mine, but this wouldn't be the end for the mine, as with rallying from the town of Marston Heights, it was turned into a heritage railway. Neil, Clive and Matthew would help to rebuild the line to be passenger standard, as since the line had been industrial prior to 1965, many gates and fences were installed. The three engines would gracefully retire from regular service, running the heritage line by themselves, a far more manageable pace for the over century-old engines at this point. The line would be renamed to the Marston Heights Coal Railway, and otherwise known as the MHCR for short. Kate would be purchased from the coal mine, eventually being sent to the Waterton branch, but I'll discuss that a little later on. Some odd occurrences would happen to the former S&M engines. First, Matthew would see the ghost of Patrick Clifton, believing him to be real, having conversations with him even though he wasn't really there. Then, Neil had a severe mental breakdown brought on by a case of locomotive dementia, otherwise known as smokebox syndrome. Clive would tell Matthew the truth, allowing for Matthew to stop having visions of Patrick, causing quite a great deal of distress to the engine. Neil and Matthew would be sent to the works, where they were cured of their smokebox syndrome, becoming as sharp as when they exited Glasgow all those years ago. Once the engines had been repaired and had therapy sessions with Mickey, Neil, Clive and Matthew would be repainted into the new livery of the MHCR, opening and running the line to great success a few months later. Kate would struggle on the Waterton branch, as since she had been an industrial coal engine, her way of the passenger coaches were far from desirable. Goods work would be in the same boat as this, as the oil freight had to be handled quite delicately, unlike coal trucks. Kate would be momentarily reassigned to the Farquhar branch, where under teachings from Toby, she was able to learn how to properly operate passenger trains, and by extension, goods trains. Up at the Enlofer Quarry, following the retirement of Clive, his replacement would be purchased. The Class 04 diesel was called Mavis, and she was, well to put it simply, inexperienced with the shunting work. The quarry soon was in a right state, with trucks being haphazardly placed everywhere with no order. Percy would soon refuse to get his train, leading to Mavis attempting to take a train from the quarry to Farquhar. However, the trucks appeared to be the way of the old Westinghouse brake, as air pressure needing to be required to activate the brakes for some reason. Because of this, when some of the brake pipes inevitably failed, the fully loaded train that Mavis was carrying became a runaway. Toby, who was coming up the line to talk to Mavis about her way of handling the quarry, was able to stop Mavis with the help of the dip. It was revealed in an investigation by Mickey that the trucks should have engaged their brakes, but due to damage from heavy shunting, they could not work. Mavis would then accept help from Toby to help run the quarry efficiently, as she finally understood that her methods weren't exactly the greatest. Soon, the quarry was running at the most efficient pace it had ever run at. Kate would be reassigned back to the Waterton branch, having been an experienced engine on the Farquhar branch. She would be repainted into a green livery to match the other engines on the Waterton branch. With the Marston Heights coal mine closed, coal had to be imported from the mainland. Francis handled these trains, much to his disdain. It will be revealed that when he arrived with one of his trains that he was actually designed by Robert Hall. Barry would exit the works around this time, being a far different engine. The experiment, called steam diesel conversion, otherwise known as SDC, had made Barry look like a steam engine, but operate with a diesel engine, much to the other engine's shock. SDC works by putting a diesel-electric motor that powered the driving wheels, the fuel coming from oil stored in a tender. The trials would commence with Barry having to pace himself as the heat of a standard firebox is far greater than the heat that can fry an engine, much to his displeasure. One day, Barry would take a train for Donald, as Donald was feeling unwell. It would be the straw that would break the camel's back, as his engine would fail at the base of Gordon's Hill. Once these kinks were finally ironed out, BR would adopt the SDC initiative for non-faceless engines, as efficiency improved, but the running and maintenance costs were lower. This process would soon be known as the overhaul. It is revealed that Edward would later have the overhaul, but no specific date is mentioned as of this video. So Topham Hatt would find out that Peter had been the only engine on the main line to have never pulled coaches, and so for a change of pace, Peter was assigned to a stopping train from Knapford to Vickerstown. Francis was kind of annoyed at this, telling Peter that a man, Luther von Haas, was searching for Peter, as his family had been in the hospital in Germany back in 1945, much to Peter's shame. Peter was miserable at this news, although he then pulled the train successfully in a montage that I actually kinda like. He would become depressed, however, at the end of it. At Vickerstown, Peter would go to the water tower, a move that would end his life. Luther von Haas would be at the Vickerstown yards, and armed with an old German pistol, he would fire 3 shots into Peter, and combined with Peter's undiagnosed metal fatigue, would kill the 8F. Rest in peace Peter, 1935 to 1965, age 30. At the scrapyard, Mr. Zorro would appear to pay his final respects. It would be revealed in a flashback to 1939 that with Michael gone, the bills of the Creedies had increased dramatically, leading the mother to kill herself. One of the boys would find the body and steal the gun. In 1965, the same boy would become a man and would use the same gun to kill the man that he found personally responsible for his mother's death, Mr. Zorro. Rest in peace Nigel Zorro, 1890 to 1965, age 75. The following night, the same man who killed Mr. Zorro would sneak onto the Skarloey Railway. At a train outside Franks & Sons, he would place a device into one of the crates of the dynamite, an action that would cause the darkest week in Sodor's modern history. Although Fort Sudrian had been closed for several years, military ships still occasionally docked on Sodor, docking at either Brendam or Knapford. One day, the HMS Krakatoa would dock at Brendam, with the unloading and loading process being a general frenzy, with munitions and explosives being loaded. Benson would act as general military hard-nosed self, ordering everyone to do everything. He would berate Francis and Thomas at Rellsworth one day, as Francis was on the verge of a breakdown and Thomas appeared to be just lounging around. Thomas would then take some of the fuel from Rellsworth to Brendam, an action that would have unforeseen consequences. At Crovan's Gate, Diesel and Eric would pick up a shipment from the Skarloey Railway, the explosives and munitions being loaded onto their trains. The pair would depart from Brendam, and with that, the scene is set, let the fireworks begin. Benson would bump into a train that was being unloaded, setting off a device that had been placed in one of the trucks by an unknown man. The device would cause a chain reaction that would start a fire and explode the train, catching the fully loaded Krakatoa on fire and killing Benson. Rest in peace Benson, 1911 to 1965, age 54. Mickey and Derek would get to quick work trying to extinguish the fire. However, a fireball from the fiery Krakatoa landed on Thomas's fuel tanker, catching it alight. Thomas would try to bravely reverse out of Brendam with the tanker. He would then try to get away from the fiery inferno when it exploded. Thomas and his crew would not survive. Rest in peace Thomas, 1905 to 1965, age 60. Robert Hall would attempt to save Thomas, but the damage was far too severe. While the cleanup was in progress, Toby would connect the fact that Benson bumping the train and the whole thing catching on fire happened far too quickly to be an accident. The final death toll from the Brendam blast would total 56. At the scrapyard, live ammunition was found. Mickey, Donald, Toby, and Derek attempted to flee the scene, but Donald's valve get jammed. Mickey then sacrificed himself, putting himself into the path of the explosion, killing him. Rest in peace Mickey, 1912 to 1965, age 53. Because Kildane's scrapyard was damaged, and with Barrow's scrapyard overloaded, Thomas was sent to Barry Island. Francis would take Thomas, as all the NWR engines, big and small, paid their respects. Mr. Zorro's murder case had revealed some new details, as the bullets matched those that were found at the murder of Gregory Hall back in 1960 and Angela Creedy back in 1938. Donald would finally connect the dots, assuming that it was Robert Hall, formerly Robert Creedy, who had caused the revenge attacks. Donald would angrily accuse Robert, but he would reply with the fact that Robert had strong alibis during every single accident. Donald would then realise that it was Sean Creedy who had caused all of this. At the former Creedy residence, Sean Creedy would break in. He would see hallucinations of his mother's suicide, and so armed with his father's revolver, he would kill himself right there and then, ending the madness. Robert would denounce his brother, and while there were some rumours about how Robert could have helped with some of the accidents, that didn't stop him marrying and having 2 beautiful daughters. Okay, wow, that was quite a depressing ending. I know that some people online didn't like this series for the short pacing and other nitpicks, but I actually kind of enjoyed this series. I'm always a sucker for when an event 20 years ago becomes a relevant key to a future season. Really does keep you on your toes about what to note down. I can't deny that the season was actually quite well made, so I'll give this season about an 8 out of 10. Also quickly, before I continue with the timeline, I want to quickly shout out Shaman Lover 394. They basically gave me a quick overview on everything that happened in Season 6. I could not have done the next part of this video without them, so thank you. In late 1965, Derek was appointed to the new Fire and Rescue Chief, which also meant he led the counselling services. This was handy as Percy was having hallucinations of a dead Thomas. And yes, I say dead, as in the narration Edward mentions how the engines now tell passengers about who inquire about where Thomas is. The truth about what he did at Brendan, which pretty much says, yeah, he's gone. Although in saying, it's still on the cards for him to appear beyond the publication of this video, a la Brian from Family Guy. And then honestly, I don't fully approve of this. They basically tell Percy to get over Thomas's death, and then Percy just gets over him. Like, come on, Thomas was like your best mate for like the past 30 years and you just kind of forget about him like that? I'm not so sure about that, if I'm perfectly honest. Anyways, also in late 1965, both Donald and Henry would both finally speak to Robert Hall about the events that had killed Michael Creedy, with Robert directly forgiving them both. 1966 would see a surprise inspection of the railway as the higher-ups of BR would note that the many incidents had happened over the previous years. There would be an informant who had instigated this request for an investigation, a man that I can't really recall the name of right now and I can't really be bothered checking. He was later sent away from the island because of this, and I will take the honours of the weakest episode from Controller to this. This episode was just so boring, honestly. If I ranked it, it's at the bottom of the list. In 1966, Sir Topham Hatt would retire as he had been in the control of the Northwestern region for about 20 years up to this point. A replacement was sourced but initially wasn't the favourite choice. Ronald Watson was an accountant from BR, so he basically decided to streamline everything on Sodor, even putting forward plans for a junction on Gordon's Hill to Sudbury, so trains from Brenham didn't have to go all the way to Wellsworth, only to then be rerouted back towards the mainland. Going on at the same time at this, and a point that I briefly forgot to mention, because of the damage that Donald had received the previous year, he had undergone SDC, although the results didn't 100% work for him as it did for Barry. This was likely due to the fact that Barry was more relatively new, whereas Donald is just about over 50 by this point in time. He would also have a few breakdowns, and it was one of these breakdowns on a double-headed train with Edward, done because of the aforementioned streamlining of the trains. Edward would have to struggle on his own, taking the train from roughly Sudbury to Rellsworth on his own, a mighty feat for an engine of his age. The junction plans would take shape, but it would bring a certain engine to the NWR. This certain engine would be Dudley. He would be assigned to the branch because of the increased traffic numbers, charming along with Rosie, Edward, and the Scottish twins. But Diesel he seemed to have more prejudice against him from the start. This became more apparent with other Diesels, with Boker being stuck in a shed due to misplaced trucks, and Diesel being involved in an incident involving faulty trucks. When confronted by Boker and Rosie, Dudley would lash out and in full view of Ronald Watson, so Dudley was sent away. On his way to Railgate, he would crash into what is believed to be Theodore after the former ran a red signal. Although how the hell Dudley died and not the engine police transporting him is questionable because, like, you would have a guy in front of him. Unless, of course, there's no one in front of him, but then Dudley could have just steamed away. But if there's a person there, what, they just both collided and then sent that one police officer into the back rooms or something? I don't know, you can kind of see how this is all kind of like, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense and doesn't exactly line up. Anyways, in 1967, Rellsworth would get a new park built, put in place at the yard which was now removed at this time due to the new spur junction on Gordon's Hill. We then also learned that the engines have been getting new radios installed, one such case involving Boko breaking down on the hill and Daisy going to rescue him. However, Daisy then broke down. It is then revealed slightly later that the Queen will be visiting to christen the new park, and after the Royal Express breaks down, Daisy brings the Queen to the park. This whole episode feels a little bit like that one NWR Tales episode, doesn't it? By this time, Boxwood Ballast Mine was drying up rapidly, with the potential threat of closure imminent to some engines, as with increased road traffic, they saw the line going the same way as the MSR. Morale wasn't helped by the death of Sir Handel Brown at age 73. Onslow would take a bit of the brunt from the former MSR crew, but after saving Stewart from some runaway slate trucks, both sides made amends. A new controller for the SKR, a Mr. Mannering, would help to run the line through this turbulent time, turning the SKR into a solely heritage/tourist railway from this point on. At a meeting with Sir Handel Brown prior to his death, the pair had proposed a new minimum gauge railway which would then become known as the Islesdale Railway. Bert, Rex and Mike would be brought to Sodor to help build the line and run preliminary services. This was done because although the line was envisaged as solely a ballast industrial line, the locals had managed to convince Mr. Mannering to consider passenger traffic as well, and so it was arranged. Even after an incident involving Rex and a cow named Buttercup, the construction and trials were a success. We have now reached 1968, and on April 1st, the Islesdale Railway opened. Although, really quickly, Small Railway Engines was published in 1967 in September, so unless Wilbert was there during the construction, I doubt he was able to get the three engines in the Islesdale Railway written out and fully noted down. Anyways, back to the timeline. We then see each of the engines meet Matilda Fletcher, listening as she plays the piano in the ruins of her house. Or at least that's what I said previously. I realise my gaffe thanks to the comments on part 1, and if you're watching this as the full piece, you might need to just look at the comments on that video just to know what I'm talking about here. This is my fault. I presumed Matilda and Mrs. Fletcher to be the same, as naturally since Horace was fully named, and Matilda was the only other new name that had come up, I hope you can see how I kind of came to this conclusion. I will call her Matilda for simplicity, as she was never given a full name by Victor Tanzig in the episode herself. Even the wiki doesn't have anything about her except for just Mrs. Fletcher. Anyways, she was always waiting for him to come home, standing on the bridge to try and spot him, but he never appeared. When the agents found out about the story of Matilda, Mike, who wasn't always tactful, told her the truth and convinced her to meet Horace in the afterlife. And so she went, playing one final song on the piano. 1968 would see a wave of protests across the island, Norman Grant leading the main movement. However, as Joey would notice, he always had a habit of getting arrested and walking free on the same day. One night, Kyle Baxter was struck and killed as an unknown protester was tagging one of the oil refineries. Because of this, a widespread investigation was held, and after some investigation by Joey and Wendell, a picture of Constable Rollins was found. Now this photo was quite compromising, and as it was found to be in the possession of Norman Grant, Joey put 2 and 2 together. Grant was put into jail for his role in apparently killing Baxter, while Collins was arrested for corruption. But where there's smoke, there's fire, and so all the police officers on Sodor had to be investigated for corruption, with ultimately 33 bent coppers found. However, a man by the name of Murphy would make accusations against Joey, and so Joey was suspended pending inquiry, so Lenny was brought to Sodor. These allegations were proven to be false, but another matter came to life. Elliot Dobson was still around, with a new wife, Agatha. Joey and Lenny would both interrogate the pair, where it was found that Agatha had attempted to murder Helen back in 1963 over jealousy and love and all that kind of lovey-dovey stuff. However, Helen had survived, and Elliot in a fit of rage would push and accidentally kill Agatha. He would somehow be cleared on the charges, but has since moved away from Sodor entirely. Fair enough. However, it was found that Joey and Lenny hadn't exactly gone about getting all this information legally, and so they were both effectively booted from the Rail Inspector's unit. However, the game wasn't entirely up for them, as Ronald Watson allowed for Lenny to join the Fire and Rescue unit with Derek, while Joey was allowed to work on the Farquhar branch. A short while after this change was implemented, Joey requested to be repainted in blue, which made him look a little bit like Thomas. This was odd at first, but eventually the engines got used to it, as did the passengers. And finally, in 2015, Edward would tell all the tales of his time from 1934 to 1968, with sprinklings of lore throughout to the early years and a few stories that may or may not have happened. And with that, we finally leave the timeline, as well as Season 6. And it was kind of boring, and like the fact that I've only talked about it for quite literally 4 pages of script, kind of shows how much yet little happened in this season. And I don't know, it's an alright season, but not one that I'm going to jump back to anytime soon. 7 out of 10, and you can see the very obvious kind of dip in the graph so far. Since we now have all the years mapped out, we can now finally say we're done with the Stories of Sodor timeline, and wow, this took a long time to make. And judging by the fact that I needed 2 videos to get to this point, you can kind of tell, or 1 depending upon which version you're watching. because once again Victor is continuing to make his series possibly up to the 2010s I'm guessing, we still have a long way to go in terms of season count. I will come back to this video and remaster the remaster when Stories of Sodor officially ends, which could be at least 5 years for all I know. If you've made it this far, thank you. I guess you may as well like, share, subscribe, comment, do the things that YouTube tells me to tell you if you enjoy this type of content. This is TWMallard38 signing off for now. Have a good one, folks. More content is on its way. Possibly a remaster of the T1E2H3 timeline. Who knows? Anyways, goodbye.